Like, listen, right, I don't like Stanley. I think the only person I have been was Stanley.
And Nate, Stanley doesn't state the obvious, like what the up. He's used talking points. Yes, he does. Yes, he does.
The nature of American culture, it's a white people problem. Okay. I literally said they need to understand.
You really gotta let these people bother you like that. If they want to beef with you, it's called Stanley versus the world.
And just assume their character by stereotype?
I think people do that every day.
Okay, I didn't ask you.
What do I think it's okay?
Good morning. It's Sunday, March 8th, and this is the Georgia Gang. I'm Russ Spencer, in for Lori Geary. The overwhelming U.S. attack on Iran's Islamist regime has political repercussions here at home ahead of the 2026 midterms. Governor Kemp's budget includes a new college scholarship that, unlike Hope, is based on a student's financial need. It's the Dream Scholarship. And the State House shoots down a Republican effort to put a constitutional amendment cutting property taxes on the November ballot. Plus, qualifying week and crossover day. A lot to talk about. Melita, Phil, and Theron are here, and Ryan Mahoney is filling in for Brian. The discussion begins right now.
From the Fox 5 studios, the Georgia Gang starts now.
The new war in the Middle East has Americans divided along the same old lines for the most part. Some America First conservatives object to President Trump's attention overseas, but a Fox News poll finds 84% of Republicans approve of the U.S. military action against Iran, compared to just 20% of Democrats and 40% of independents. Democratic U.S. Senator John Ossoff and Republican Mike Collins, who wants Ossoff's job, addressed the conflict as they qualified for the race this week.
He's taking the United States to war for regime change without evidence of imminent threat, without having exhausted diplomacy, without clear objectives or a plan for the aftermath, and without the consent of Congress.
Iran has been at war with Western civilization for 40 plus years. This is a good surgical strike. They were not willing to give up their nuclear weapons. As a matter of fact, at the end of the day, they want to kill Americans, and that's what they've been doing.
In Congress, war powers resolutions designed to rein in President Trump failed this week in both the House and Senate, mostly along party lines. The president said Thursday it's over when he wants it to be. Again, Ryan Mahoney with us this morning, the president and senior strategist at Sugarcane Strategies. Good to have you here, Ryan.
Great to be here.
Senator Ossoff says that the Republicans running against him, all of them are puppets of President Trump. How do you assess the politics of all of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that everyone has taken their corners as far as Republicans and Democrats as it relates to Iran. What I'm looking at from a Republican strategist point of view is gas prices. I mean, Kuwait said today that they're going to cut production. How is that going to impact affordability? And so that's really what I think we need to focus on now is how long are we going to be there? What are our key objectives? And what is the impact on the bottom line?
All right, Theron, what do you say? Gas prices, by the way, are up 30 cents in the past week.
Well, let's stay there, Russ. Gas prices has actually gone up 10% just in the last week. Driving in here to the studios, I'm seeing upwards to $4 a gallon. And so this president promised us affordability. He said in his campaign he would lower gas prices. So he's failed to deliver on that promise. But going back to what Senator Ossoff said, is that this president told us it was an American first agenda, right? He was going to try to protect the homeland. He also told us, Russ, that when he bombed Iran over 8 to 10 months ago, that it was over. He had eliminated their entire nuclear program. But then he goes back in and bombs them again, and now it's a proposed regime change. He also, as the senator said, did this without congressional approval. And so I think this, as an American, if you show me that there's an imminent threat on our lives and they truly intend to kill Americans, of course, I will support that as a Democrat. But until you produce that evidence and you're killing innocent people, particularly a girls' school where people were murdered and killed, and now Americans are being killed, I think that this president and these congressional members who are supporting him deserve to give the American people the truth.
Okay. The mullahs, though, are terrible people, obviously. Is there a political risk in opposing that operation to get rid of them?
It's opposing it with a facts-driven, merit-driven, sort of a metrics-driven strategy. again, if you're telling me that they're building nuclear weapons and they're intending to harm Americans, absolutely, Russ, I will be for that. But until I get that information, and I think Congress needs to be at the table, I still don't think that this president has the credibility to make the majority of approve. And you look at your ratings, 40% of independents only approve of this war. That means 60% of them disapprove.
All right, Phil, the Republican
to unpack here, but you didn't mention the polls, Russ, that show that over 85% of the American people know that Iran is a threat to the United States. And I would maintain it's an imminent threat for 47 years. They've been killing Americans for 47 years. They chant death to America. They are producing uranium, as we know. In fact, when they were negotiating just the other day, Steve Witkoff, the lead negotiator, was shocked that they were bragging. Actually, the Iranians were bragging that they have the uranium for long-range ballistic missiles. Ask yourself a question. Why are they building long-range ballistic missiles? It's to reach Europe. It's to reach North America. It's an imminent threat. John Ossoff really needs to do his homework here. This is an imminent threat, and there's the War Powers Act. Democrat presidents, your beloved President Obama, used it plenty of times. He blew up a wedding in Afghanistan and killed an American citizen with drone strikes, used the War Powers Act. 60 days now, the president has to go to Congress and do an explanation. We can talk about gas prices. We can talk about whether the regime has fallen. There's a lot to talk about, granted. But I think that the American people will see that this was the right thing to do. You had to nip this threat in the bud.
Now, how does this end, though? Because the Republican Guards have lots of weapons.
Well, as a veteran, I'm proud of the U.S. Army. I'm proud of all the armed forces and the Allied attacks with Israel. How will it end? We have absolute air power as we tape, which is great. That means we can destroy anything on the ground. The Kurds are coming in. It's a U.S. allied militia that will be putting pressure on the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. I think they keep killing the head of the guards. So let's ask this question and talk about it in a few weeks. But so far, this has been a great military operation. And yes, the president is still reporting to the American people. He's far more transparent than Biden, who we never heard anything about.
Melita, we get the sense that the Kurds have seen this movie before.
They have. But, you know, the thing that we're not talking about is the fact that Georgia has 9 military bases. The military presence in Georgia is very strong. There are a lot of retired military people in this state. And the administration is all over the map. They don't have a coherent message about what their plan was because that plan didn't exist. You ask the question, how does it end? You really should never start a war without having an end game plan. And if it's really about regime change, the infrastructure for changing the regime and empowering the people to change the regime should have been in place. It was not. So the right questions to be asking are, why was our military put into a war that we didn't have a plan for? What is the plan for getting out? And why don't those who've already died, why didn't they deserve some presence to welcome those bodies back to our soil instead of coming back to nothing?
All right, Melita, thank you. A big week, of course, in Georgia politics. This was qualifying week for Georgia candidates. Dozens lined up at the state capitol with entourages of different sizes to make it official. I asked our Deidre Dukes, who covers the Capitol, whether the outbreak of the war overshadowed the ritual, and she said, in her estimation, it did not. So lots of folks there, obviously lining up on both sides there, and Jason Estevez was one of those who had a big group of people there.
Yeah, former State Senator Jason Estevez came in with a group of people. It was a lot of people who were supporting him. He's, walking up the stairs, high-fiving folks and going to qualify. You also had Michael Thurman, who qualified to run for governor, had a town hall meeting of 21,000 people who showed up. He only expected 1,000. And Russ, what was interesting about this town hall meeting is that he said, look, not everyone can drive to Atlanta and find a place to park at an affordable rate and come into the Capitol. So what he did, he opened it up to the people of Georgia from all over. And the questions that they got were really good. But also you saw, I know you guys are going to talk about the Republicans, but, Burt Jones showed up with a lot of African Americans supporting him as well. But of course, Keisha Lance Bottoms qualified, Derek Jackson qualified. Rua made the switch. And I think as we tape, Olu Brown qualified as well. And I think surprising interest into the lieutenant governor's race where Josh McLaurin qualified, but Nabila Islam made a switch, who was originally supposed to run for insurance commissioner. She qualified to run for lieutenant governor.
Phil, what stood out to you?
Well, obviously, the two titans are in the Republican gubernatorial primary, and of course, Rick Jackson and Burt Jones. And of course, you have Chris Carr and Brad Raffensperger that are trailing in the polls right now. I think that it was interesting that I think John King benefits the insurance commissioner because of what you're describing, Theron. You're having going to be a tough Democrat primary there for that position. I think the Republican constitutional officers are in very good shape. They won statewide the last time. They should be in good position this time. Just to comment on the Democrat side, it's interesting to see the division in the Democratic Party with Mike Thurmond, who I would say is a mainstream liberal Democrat. That was quite a tribute to him with that amount of audience you're talking about, Theron. But also, you see Keisha Lance Bottoms, and also, I don't know how Estevez is going to do. Maybe he'll get some traction. We were talking about he's not getting traction. Maybe he will. That'll be very interesting. And on the congressional side, just something that I thought will be of interest to the viewers, Tricia Pridemore, who's currently on the Public Service Commission, is announcing for Barry Loudermilk's congressional district because he's retiring.
Lady, what stood out to you?
Well, no matter what happens in November, we're going to see seismic shifts in Georgia's political landscape come January because the 4 top constitutional offices will all change. You have 4 congressional offices, possibly 5, that will change over the course of this year. And there are 3 dozen open seats in the Georgia General Assembly. So that's a lot of shifts and changes. I think it's interesting to see sons of like former Congressman Jack Kingston running in CD1, and you've got the son of Ag Commissioner Gary Black, former Ag Commissioner, running for a House seat. You've also even got a Republican candidate named Elvis running for a House seat. So I just think that we're in for a very interesting 2 months as the primary races settle out on both sides of the aisle, and then a long, hot summer as people go door to door to motivate the voters who possibly haven't voted in the past few election cycles. Because what we saw in Texas was a groundswell of voter turnout in their primary. And so there's a lot of room to motivate voters on both sides of the aisle in Georgia.
Ryan, I thought it was interesting. State Senator Nabila Parks decided to run for lieutenant governor. She says in part because Greg Dolezal put forth an advertisement that she considered Islamophobic, saying that Georgia should be Sharia free. Is that a big issue in this race, do you think?
Sharia law, it reminded me of elections past. And so when I saw that ad, I was, there's 2 parts to it that kind of bother me. One is I just don't like AI generated content. I feel like voters deserve to see their candidates. They deserve authenticity, realism, etc. And trying to sort through what's real and what's fake is one more thing that's going to keep them from participating in elections. That's an issue. But right now, no matter what poll you look at, people are worried about cost of living, property taxes, their paycheck not going far enough. And so I think anyone on the Republican side who doesn't have ads that speak to those issues is really missing an opportunity.
All right. What else did you see on Qualified Week?
Yeah, so I mean, Melita mentioned this. I think it's really, really interesting that if you go back, let's say 10 years ago and look at our delegation, most of those people aren't here anymore. And they're going to be replaced by people who are in their late 20s, early 30s, which is just sort of wild of that kind of change of we had doctors and we had these lawyers and now we have young business leaders that are possibly going to be in Congress. The one that I want to point out, though, is Mike Collins' district, the 10th Congressional, Houston Gaines versus now Ryan Millsap. Ryan Millsap said he's going to spend $4 million in that race. Ryan was kind of the leader against the heartbeat bill in 2019 on behalf of Hollywood. And so it'll be interesting to see him square up in a very red district against Houston.
All right, Brian, thanks. Out of time for this. Coming up, the House rejects a sweeping plan to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot to cut property taxes. And Governor Kemp has a dream.
Have a question or comment for the Georgia Gang? Email them at georgiagang@foxtv.com.
The property tax overhaul spearheaded by House Speaker John Burns didn't get the 120 votes it needed this week to put a constitutional amendment on the November ballot. The 99 to 73 vote was largely along party lines. Speaker Burns had originally proposed phasing out all taxes on a family's primary residence. Phil, of course, the governor's priority seems to be cutting income taxes, but I gather that this is not over.
It is not over. In fact, it was kind of a sad day in Georgia when you saw all the Democrats, I think except one, that refused to vote for almost eliminating the homestead tax, which everybody is in favor of. And I thought the Speaker's Chief of Staff, Chris Riley, kind of put it in good perspective. He said these Democrats go home. Not all, but all too many go home and say we're against the homestead tax. But then on this day, when they had a chance to really almost eliminate it, they failed. And so the Republicans are to be commended. The Republicans are the ones that are going to give money back to the people of Georgia. That's the good news if you forget everything else I say today. Affordability talked about by the Democrats. No. They had all this blather, but when it came to doing affordability, they failed to do it. And of course, there's other things I could talk about. There'll be refunds for taxpayers. There'll be more money, for example, for, oh my gosh, $850 million in homeowner tax relief. Thank you, Republicans.
Melita?
Well, what you did not have with the proposal about property taxes was an overall picture and plan for how you replaced that revenue and where the replacement revenue would come from. And so it's fine, well, and good to talk about, oh, we're going to eliminate one kind of taxes. But when you don't have a coherent plan that's clear and understandable for how that revenue continues to come in for schools and for local law enforcement and for many essential government services, then yes, the Democrats had to show some common sense and vote it down.
How do you think this shakes out, Ryan?
I mean, Speaker Burns has proven to be a smooth operator, and nothing happens without him knowing it's going to happen. And so I think he gets a win out of this no matter what. And Democrats are on the record of opposing a massive tax overhaul.
But real quick, Russ, if I can jump in here, what we saw at the state capitol, and to back up something that Melita said, and I want to quote the House Minority Leader, Carolyn Hughley. She said that basically the math is not mathing, which goes to Melita's point about the actual, sort of impact that this will have on local governments. You also saw school boards, mayors, counties come out against this. But I agree with Ryan. Don't count out the Speaker just yet, and definitely don't count out the redhead, Chris Riley.
All right. Remember this, though, it's a gradual reduction, and it's also a constitutional amendment. So even if you opposed it, why not just have the people vote on it rather than you just stopping it?
And you were at the Capitol this week, Phil.
I know.
You were spotted, and you were down there. You weren't wearing the lobbyist badge, but you did have the proper identification.
I'm a journalist.
You did have your journalist ID, yes. But you know this, Phil. It takes 120 votes to pass a constitutional amendment. It got 99 votes. How does the Speaker cut a deal? Because there's a lot of maneuvering, a lot of negotiation going on around this bill. Can he find 21 Democrats and hold his Republicans to get the 120 he needs?
All right, we'll see what happens in the second half of the session. Governor Kemp signed an amended budget this week that includes more than $300 million for a needs-based scholarship. That move would put Georgia in line with 48 other states that offer financial help to disadvantaged students. The 3-decade-old Hope Scholarship, of course, is merit-based. The Dream Scholarship will start with $25 million in the bank and a $300 million endowment to sustain it for years to come. What do you think, Melita?
Well, I think it's long overdue. It's a good thing, and it's something that many Democrats have proposed for years, so it's great that the Republicans came around for it.
How about you, Phil?
I would have to agree with that. I think it was necessary.
Well, I would say this. Too many young people actually give up on their college dreams, Russ, because they can't afford it. And I'm glad you pointed that out. I mean, we can go through the list of state representatives and state senators, many of whom still serving, that are Democrats, some of whom actually resigned or retired. But this was the right thing for the governor to do. Now, keep in mind, as a time where we sit here, correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, I think we got a $16 billion surplus. This proposal gives $325 million to need-based scholarships. We're also giving out a lot of tax things, a lot of different priorities in the state. So I applaud it. It was the right thing for the governor to do. They had a big press conference down there, but we still need to make sure that we do more when it comes to giving people opportunity for higher education. And not everyone wants to go to a 4-year college. Some folks can go to a technical school, and some people can explore entrepreneurship.
Yeah, there aren't a lot of issues that get this kind of bipartisan agreement, are there?
No, there's not. But it shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, I think the governor has proven over the years that he is willing to do the right thing, even if it's not what his party wants or if it's not the most politically advantageous thing. And so I don't think he's worried about his legacy, but this is definitely a legacy thing where kids for generations to come will be able to access higher education, and they can thank Brian Kemp for it.
All right. Coming up, lawmakers from Clayton County say they want more from Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. We'll talk about that.
Join the discussion on the Georgia Gang Facebook page and watch past episodes on the Georgia Gang YouTube channel.
Friday was crossover day at the state capitol, the deadline for a bill to pass in either the House or Senate to stay alive in the legislative session, with some arcane exceptions that we don't really need to get into this morning. Longtime viewers of this program know that we tape on Friday. So let's talk about what you're looking at. What do you think is going to potentially get through today?
Yeah, two major things. I mean, I'm looking at these election-related bills. There's a whole bevy of them that could fundamentally change the way that we cast ballots in November. So I'm very curious about that. But probably more important, House Bill 1013, the lemon pepper bill, where we can decide once and for all that this is our state chicken wing flavor. And so I'm watching and waiting with bated breath for that one.
Well, I agree with Ryan. I had actually State Representative Eric Bell on my podcast, Darren's Take. We did a long episode about this bill. It was shocking to me, Russ, how many Republicans, Phil, came up to me and said, hey, I eat lemon pepper wings all the time. And you guys know, I said Magic City was my place where I go get the wings. And shout out to the Hawks. They're going to be my winner this week for doing the Magic Monday. But to his point, elections bills are coming through. Also, some protesting bills, immigration bills are going through. And then, of course, Russ, this session has been all about taxes. Republicans trying to do what they can to join the Democrats when it comes to the affordability crisis that we're seeing in the state. And then I think that, honestly, there's a couple other bills out there that deals with healthcare, but just too many to go through. But I would tell our viewers, pay attention to next week's show, because a lot of these bills will probably cross over or they may not cross over.
Well, Phil, do we have a bipartisan agreement on lemon pepper or not?
Yes, and I prefer the right wings, actually, of that. But anyhow, that was a good laundry list you had. We'll be watching that. I like the one where we're going to make it a felony, where these left-wing activists try to block vehicles or and impede them when we're trying to deport illegal immigrants. But anyhow, I think taxes, yes, you're right about that. We'll have to see. I did see, as we were taping, though, Russ, I saw where the House Rules Committee was going to look at a sports betting bill, and I had to chuckle at that because it's failed for what, 10 years now? I don't remember. So I guess we'll watch that.
Malia?
Well, crossover.
I guess I should go ahead and do this. Welcome to Stanley versus the World. It is Monday afternoon. This is the Georgia Gang, and I really intended on showing this every Monday. To King Pick's question, it's basically a news roundup that's Georgia-centric, but they do cover some national topics. And I actually think as far as kind of like, these local PBS type news shows, it's one of the better ones. So anyway, to the point about legalizing sports betting, it'll eventually come to Georgia. Here's why I think so. Years ago when I was a kid, bringing the lottery to the state was like a huge deal. It had been, it had failed to pass the houses, both state houses, and get signed by the governor for God only knows how long. And eventually the lottery passed, but to do it, they had to create a Hope Scholarship, which basically it's a merit-based scholarship for in-state schools. So sports betting, they'll probably wind up saying, hey, some of this money has to go to education or some cause like that. So we will get our vices.
Day is kind of the ultimate exercise in passing the good, defeating the bad, and making sure the downright ugly never sees the light of day. And it's interesting to me that the day started with 51 bills on the Senate calendar and only 15 on the House calendar. But of course, the House Rules Committee can meet throughout the day and add bills. I think it'll be very interesting to see whether the bill to make Rick Jackson ineligible to run for governor actually makes it to the floor. But that's an interesting purely political get you, Bill.
All right, we'll see what happens next week. Some state lawmakers representing Clayton County have proposed a bill to end the property tax exemption for Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. They say the millions in extra funds would be a huge benefit to Clayton County residents. Opponents, including lawmakers representing Atlanta and Fulton County, point out that other major airports around the country have the same property tax exemption that Hartsfield-Jackson has enjoyed for 80 years. Darren, what's your take?
Look, I am going to be fully disclosed here. I'm adamantly opposed to House Bill 942 for a few reasons. Russ, number one, this mayor has been willing to talk to Clayton County officials. There were conversations had, but unfortunately this bill was dropped, and you saw the city, the airport, and other folks come out against it. The second thing that this bill will do is that it undermines the ability for the city to actually keep its bond ratings. You know, at a time where City of Atlanta has a AAA bond rating, they will not be able to deal with the bonds that they need to do. And then the last thing that it does, Russ, and I'll be fully disclosed here, I'm a person who now represent people who do business at the airport. I do business at the airport. This will hurt small businesses significantly, female-owned businesses, small businesses, minority-owned businesses, concessionaires. And at a time where the airport employs so many people, I think that this would be a very, very bad bill because it will put that tax burden on those small businesses who employ so many people.
Phil, what say you?
I can see both sides of this issue. And yes, we do want to protect the city's AAA bond rating. That's very important. And I'm in favor of small businesses like all of us here on the panel are. But I do think to have some perspective for our viewers, Clayton County has been screwed over for the last few decades. There should have been more of a tax allocation to Clayton County, and Atlanta did not properly address that over the years. Now, the negotiations, I think, should continue. I think that there's got to be some sort of middle ground there where Clayton County can be given more of the tax revenue.
All right, we have to save some time for winners and losers, and that is next. We'll be right back.
Time now for the week's winners and losers.
Ryan, you're our guest this week. You start.
Sure. So on the winner side, Governor Brian Kemp, final budget, $2 billion worth of tax relief for hardworking Georgians. He said he was going to do it. He's done it over and over again. That's huge. On the loser side, Kristi Noem, former DHS secretary, put herself and her political ambition ahead of the job, spent $200 million promoting herself. Glad that she got fired. And I think Mark Wayne Mullen's going to do a great job as DHS secretary.
All right, there.
Ryan, welcome. Good job today, friend. My first one is going to be Versi Zander. She works in the transparency office, the ethics office. She's retiring after 13 years. Feel like I go up there and get my badge every year. So shout out to Versi. I also want to give the speakers at the AMAC conference, and this is the Atlanta Minority Advisory Council of AMAC. Senator Halpern, Senator Nan Orrock, Representative Inga Willis, Bill Swift, and Alicia Ivey all came down to the Capitol to oppose HB 942. And then lastly, shout out to Zach and Josephine Applin. Saw them when I was around the Capitol. They're big fans of the show.
Phil?
Well, I got a winner, and it's Rodney Mims Cook Jr. He is a very legendary architect of our town, and he actually is the head of the President's Commission on the Fine Arts. I didn't realize that until I saw that in the media. And he is the architect that's helping the president do his West Wing ballroom. And I think that's going to be great. And also, I would agree with Ryan, Governor Kemp would be a winner. I'm talking about Republicans and affordability and tax relief, along with Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones. He's been a big apostle of tax relief. And of course, House Speaker John Burns.
All right, you got 15 seconds.
My winners are all the people willing to run for office and the Flint River Keeper for preparing a lawsuit. My loser of the week is Greg Dozel for that awful, racist, homophobic video that should never have been aired.
Melita, thank you. Lori, we'll be back next week.
But on this historic day, we come together to announce a brand new military coalition to eradicate the criminal cartels plaguing our region.
I didn't realize that it ended so abruptly. Let's see. I don't think I planned on watching this. So we'll just go into the news. There has been a 7th U.S. service member killed in the Middle East. And then the other announcement is Khamenei's son has been named supreme leader. So let's see here. U.S. military announced Sunday that a 7th American service member was killed in action during the war during the war with Iran. The service member, who was not identified, died Saturday after suffering injuries during the first weekend of U.S.-Israeli strikes and ensuing Iranian counterattacks across the region. He was seriously wounded at the scene of an attack. 9 more service members have been seriously injured across the region, according to a U.S. official speaking on the condition of anonymity. So that's some grim news. And another interesting thing, and I'm kind of curious why this hasn't been more plastered in the news, but apparently 2 men were charged with supporting ISIS in a Gracie Mansion attack. That's the the New York mayor's residence in New York City. Says here, federal prosecutors say that both men cited the Islamic State after they were arrested, and one said he wanted to cause more damage than the Boston Marathon bombing. No one was injured in the incident on Saturday. So here we go. Federal prosecutors, let's see, the men, Emir Balat and Ibrahim Qayyumi, were arrested on Saturday night after they attempted to detonate 2 explosive devices, including one that tested positive for TATP, a highly volatile material used in numerous terrorist attacks over the last decade, according to a criminal complaint filed Monday in Manhattan federal court. So here we go, folks. I thought ISIS was neutralized. So that is okay. So here, this is Francis Fukuyama again. We've been seeing a lot of him lately. He's got a short commentary on unconditional surrender, which is what Trump is wanting from Iran. And his comment is that unconditional surrender in Iran is a fool's errand. And boy, do we have a fool for a president. So let's hear what he has to say.
Of the many questionable decisions that President Donald Trump has made with regard to Iran, one of the strangest had to be his declaration last week that the United States would demand unconditional surrender from Tehran for the war to end. When Trump launched the attack with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, he was obviously hoping for a quick victory, something like the outcome that he achieved when he snatched Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. By Friday, the first Friday of the war, however, it had expanded across the Middle East, with Iran shooting missiles and drones at American allies and bases all over the Persian Gulf. It was clear that what remained of the Iranian leadership was not about to capitulate, and that the conflict could drag on, as Trump himself admitted, for weeks. Normally, a smart leader in such a situation would try to lower expectations and declare an achievable objective in the war, such as, degrading the better part of Iran's ability to strike targets with ballistic missiles and drones. This would then offer an opportunity for Trump to declare victory and disengage. Instead, Trump did the opposite. The new objective of unconditional surrender suddenly raised the goalposts to an unachievable height. There are any number of reasons for Iran not to capitulate in this fashion. In the first place, unconditional surrender assumes that there is a coherent government operating that can instruct the nation's military to stand down, as the Japanese emperor did in 1945. But Iran's forces, the IRGC, the Basij, and the regular military, are highly decentralized. Indeed, with the U.S.-Israeli targeting of military leadership, it's not evident there's a single coherent command and control hierarchy remaining. The second reason for thinking that surrender won't happen is that it would expose the regime to internal disintegration. Iran is today being ruled by force. A large part of the population hates the regime of the clerics that killed tens of thousands of protesters just in January alone, and has a much longer record ever since the revolution in 1979. The IRGC and Basij will not give up their weapons for one reason, because they themselves would not survive physically if they did that. A final reason for not expecting unconditional surrender is that a good part of the regime can survive and continue fighting for some time. The US-Israeli air campaign has been extremely effective in going after Iran's visible military assets, things like air defenses, ballistic missiles, drones, launch facilities, ammunition storage, military bases, and the like. But the tens of thousands of individual fighters are still there, and they will remain with residual capacity to fight back for a good long time. We've actually recently seen an example of what this looks like. The nearly 2.5-year long war between Israel and Hamas has destroyed a huge amount of infrastructure in Gaza, and it's deprived Hamas of the ability to launch major attacks. But they're still there, commanding some degree of popular support in their remaining tunnels and shelters. They've not surrendered, and they will be a big obstacle to any attempt to rebuild Gaza and restore a post-conflict government. Gaza is a much smaller territory, and Israel has been willing to enter it with ground forces. Iran, by contrast, is a very large country, and there's a lot of places for the surviving regime to shelter. It will not be possible to eliminate every missile and drone that they control, and so we can expect continuing attacks on US-aligned Gulf states and American facilities into the foreseeable future. The threat of random drones striking a big airline hub in the Gulf will be economically devastating to those countries. The basic problem that the US and Israel face has to do with the limitations of air power. We have a lot of experience with attempts to use air power to achieve political objectives, and it's not encouraging. The US 8th Air Force and the British Bomber Command flattened many German cities during World War II, hoping to break the will of the Nazi regime. But as the US Strategic Bombing Survey, a study that was done after the war, noted, this terrible campaign did not bring the regime down. The latter collapsed only when the Russians and the Western allies physically occupied Germany. I can think of only 2 cases where strategic bombing by itself achieved a clear political objective. The first was Japan's unconditional surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri after the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As in Germany, the US was willing to kill hundreds of thousands of civilians by firebombing Japanese cities, and demonstrated in August 1945 a terrible new capability that convinced the emperor and the leadership of Japan that it made no sense to fight on. The second case was Kosovo, where Serbia was attacked by NATO air power and eventually agreed to relax its grip on Kosovo. This result succeeded because the attack triggered a popular revolt against the government of Slobodan Milosevic. Even so, NATO had to assemble a peacekeeping force, KFOR, which is still on the ground in the region even as we speak. If, as I expect, the Iranian regime does not capitulate, Trump will then face 3 choices. The first is that he can back down, declare victory, and end US operations, leaving a weakened but still dangerous Iranian regime in power. Second, he could decide to send in ground forces, a move that is fraught with obvious dangers both in Iran and politically in the United States. This war is not popular now, and it is going to be even more unpopular with ground forces in the country. Although it's interesting that Trump himself hasn't entirely ruled this possibility out. The final choice would be to expand the air campaign to a broader and broader range of targets, hitting civilian infrastructure facilities like desal plants, the electrical grid, and the transportation network. This would create a huge amount of misery for the Iranian people that Trump claims to want to support. Having neutralized most military targets, further bombing will inevitably hurt ordinary civilians, just as the Israelis have done in Gaza. The US will, in effect, be bombing the rubble. Given these unappealing choices, demanding unconditional surrender was a very foolish thing for the president to have done. I'm tempted to believe that Trump just liked the sound of the words without thinking through the ways in which they would come back to haunt him. But this was only one poor choice among many, the most serious being the decision to go to war in the first place without a clear rationale for doing so. Thanks for listening to this podcast. If you like it, please think of subscribing to my Frankly Fukuyama YouTube channel. And you can read the written version of this on my Frankly Fukuyama blog, which is part of the Persuasion online magazine.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fukuyama. So let's see what else we got here. This is something that I guess I kind of knew was happening, but not in detail. Inexcusable incompetence. You know what? Let's see. How long is this? It's a little longish. It says here, everyone saw this coming except the president. An unmitigated disaster of epic proportions. These were the words from Democrats decrying Donald Trump for failing to plan to evacuate hundreds of thousands of civilians under a blizzard of retaliatory fire raining down on the Gulf states. No. Those were those were Republicans excoriating former President Joe Biden for the botched 2021 exit from Afghanistan. Back then, Representative Steve Scalise thundered, "It's a very dire situation when you see the United States Embassy being evacuated." So fast forward to last week, the Trump regime closed down 3 of our embassies, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Kuwait, abandoning U.S. citizens in those countries. Trump's minions failed to consider advanced planning to evacuate Americans from the region, leaving them to fend for themselves in places where missiles are flying and buildings are ablaze. Let's see. So apparently we got a bunch of stray Americans in the Middle East with bombs raining down on them. Yeah, well, Trump's administration is full of incompetence. And I guarantee you the reason they didn't do the evacuation is they'll say it would have telegraphed the surprise attack. And this essay ends. Unfortunately, we know how this will play out. Trump and his arrogant yes men will never admit error, let alone apologize, and Republicans on the Hill will not stir themselves to do their jobs. It will be up to the voters to throw out every elected Republican and force the removal of the architects of this catastrophe. Until that happens, Americans here and abroad will needlessly suffer and die. This is a good line right here. Americans trapped in a regional war zone, to say nothing of our armed service and regional allies, now pay the price for an unhinged and impulsive president enabled by careless juvenile advisors who think war is a video game. Damn. So, heartfelt sympathy for those who are stuck in the Middle East. And this is what I was talking about earlier. Defying Donald Trump and stepping out of the shadows, Moshtaba Khamenei ascends. So this is from Australia, ABC in Australia. Earlier in the war, President Donald Trump said the worst case scenario in Iran would be if Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's successor was as bad as the previous person. In many ways, the appointment of his son, Moshtaba Khamenei, delivers him that very outcome, him being Donald Trump. 56-year-old has never held a government position nor given many public speeches and is considered a quiet and mysterious character even inside Iran. He has been a secretive figure operating behind the scenes, Professor Mehmet Azalp, the head of the Center for Islamic Studies and Civilization at Charles Sturt University, told ABC. Apparently, Charles Sturt University is in Australia. He mainly used his father's influence, and he was a gatekeeper to his father, which made him a very powerful person, particularly within the Revolutionary Guard. So basically, the successor to the Ayatollah will be the Ayatollah's second born son, or he's the second oldest child. I don't know what to think of that, other than this regime has been around for damn near 50 years. It's not going, I don't think they're going to fold. They're not going to dry up and blow away. So probably once again, Trump is bitten off more than he can chew. So I thought this was fairly interesting. Robert Reich, the Clinton's former labor secretary, who's an economist, he has said so far the war on Iran has cost $9.4 billion. That's $1 billion per day, 41,666,667 per hour, $11,574 per second, thousands of lives lost. So that's what we're paying for. Hold on one sec here. Have I lost my story? Where is that story? Uh-oh. Well, what I was going to say, that school that was destroyed, and I think it was like 150 people, including some schoolgirls, wound up being killed in the attack. Apparently, that school was right next door to some sort of military installation. So it is now all but confirmed by the administration itself. It was a school. It was a Tomahawk missile, which is an American weapon. So here it is. So, I did have the story. Yeah, okay. Here it is. So U.S. Tomahawk struck Iranian base next to school, destroyed in deadly attack. Video appears to confirm. I thought I subscribed to this. Oh, damn it. Anyway, let me see, can I find another picture? My bad. Here. Damn it. Hold on one sec here. I wanted to see if I couldn't get to the video of this. This video actually shows the missile coming down just before it strikes. Yeah. I'm gonna have to find a better picture. I thought I subscribed to this. Oops. Well, that's not getting any better. If I can find another link, I'll use it. I'm sorry. I thought this was one of those publications I subscribed to. But we will move on. So Iraq becomes battleground for U.S. forces once again. So let's hear about this. Apparently, their militia, Shiite militia, militias in Iraq are getting into the action.
The war in the Middle East is pushing the U.S. military back into combat in Iraq against an old foe, Iran-backed militia groups that 2 decades ago battled American troops on the streets of Baghdad. Iraqi militias have attempted dozens of small-scale drone and rocket attacks since the war began in a show of support for Tehran, including against a U.S. military base and consulate in northern Iraq and a State Department facility at the Baghdad International Airport. On Saturday, rockets targeted the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, which Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani called a terrorist act by rogue groups. The U.S. said Sunday it has been carrying out attacks against the militias, acknowledging that the war in Iran is spilling over into neighboring Iraq and drawing American forces back into a place where they spent years fighting insurgents and endured heavy casualties after the 2003 invasion that deposed Saddam Hussein. We have conducted operations in Iraq as part of Operation Epic Fury, but it's in defense of U.S. troops as they've come under attack by Iran-aligned militia groups, said Captain Tim Hawkins, a spokesman for U.S. Central Command, which oversees military operations in the region. Epic Fury is the operation name for the Iran campaign. The tactics are a significant shift for the Pentagon, which has mostly avoided targeting Iraqi militias in recent years, seeking to disengage from a painful conflict once and for all. Iraqi officials say there have been multiple airstrikes apparently by U.S. warplanes on militia strongholds, including at bases near the towns of Jerf al-Sakar, south of Baghdad, and Al-Qaim, along the Iraqi-Syria border. Both locations have been used for years as depots for weapons supplied by Iran and to launch attacks at U.S. bases in Syria and Jordan. A March 4th airstrike in Baybil, in central Iraq, killed Abu Hassan al-Farihi, a commander of the U.S.-designated terror group Kataib Hezbollah, along with another militia member. Kataib Hezbollah issued a statement the day after Farihi's death, saying he was one of the group's commanders for more than 2 decades. Hawkins said he had no information that the U.S. conducted the attack. They are working to decapitate the Iranian-backed infrastructure in Iraq, said Tamer Badawi, an associate fellow who studies Iraqi militias at the Royal United Services Institute, a London think tank. Since the U.S.-Israeli war...
Here, let's have a look at this.
The war in the Middle East continues expanding this morning, and we have seen a new wave of airstrikes. Plus, Iran has a new leader. Bill Cutler joins us now with the very latest headlines from the battlefields. Bill, good morning.
Good morning, Tom. Well, the U.S. the State Department now ordering non-emergency staff and family members to leave the U.S. consulate in southern Turkey. This after a ballistic missile was intercepted in Turkish airspace. This is the first ordered departure involving a NATO ally since this conflict began. And as the war now enters its second full week, airstrikes continue across the Middle East. Here there were heavy explosions overnight as Israel announced that it had begun a, quote, wide-scale wave of strikes in 2 Iranian cities, including the country's capital of Tehran and Isfahan. Israel also carrying out airstrikes in Lebanon, targeting a financial institution in Beirut with ties to Hezbollah. Overnight, Israel says 1 person was killed and several others critically injured by an Iranian missile that struck the country and made it through Israel's air defense. And over the weekend, the son of Iran's late supreme leader was named as his successor. Mujtaba Khomeini was chosen as the country's next leader by an assembly of 88 clerics. And this morning, the Kremlin now showing its support for Iran's new leader, Russian President Vladimir Putin, sending a telegram saying congratulations to Khomeini and reaffirming Moscow's, quote, unwavering support for Tehran, adding that Russia has been and will remain a reliable partner of the Islamic Republic. Tom, we have not heard a response from President Trump yet.
I bet you haven't. Oh, my. What have we here? All right. Well, as expected, oil prices top $100 per barrel as big Middle East producers cut output amid Iran war. Yeah, they mentioned on the Georgia Gang that gas had gone up 30 cents on average in the state of Georgia. And gas is usually fairly cheap here because, Savannah and Charleston, are, where the oil comes from, where the petroleum comes from, near ports. So says here over the weekend, AAA reported the national retail average for a gallon of regular gasoline was $3.45, while Brent crude hit $101.19 shortly after trading resumed. The Iran conflict has hindered production and shipping and damaged oil and gas facilities, disrupting global supply, according to reports. So regional data show California at $5.15. Washington, I'm assuming that's Washington State, $4.60. Oregon, $4.81. And the national diesel average at $4.59. U.S. drivers now face a national gasoline average up roughly 13 cents from Friday's $3.32 and nearly 50 cents higher than last week's $2.98. Damn. With only 5 states below $3. And Georgia is not one of them, apparently. So Trump's response was concerning. He basically said that it was a small price to pay for regime change, I guess. So that's a rather cavalier attitude, I think. So looks like the U.S. military strikes another alleged drug boat in the Eastern Pacific, killing 6. On Sunday, the U.S. military said it killed 6 men in a strike on an alleged drug smuggling vessel in the Eastern Pacific Ocean and posted a video showing the boat exploding. So critics noted the strike's questionable legality and limited effectiveness, while Ecuador and the United States conducted operations this past week against organized crime groups. I talked about that last week. Our special forces in Ecuador. So I don't know if anybody's really kept up with Anthropic. It's some sort of AI company that was supposed to the Pentagon. They had some contract, defense contract, and apparently Trump ordered ties to be cut. In the move, Anthropic sues Pentagon over national security risk label. The move comes after Trump ordered agencies to stop using Anthropic's AI amid a bitter feud on how its chatbot Claude might be used in war. Let's hear this.
Man, this hot honey flavor. The new hot honey.
Josh, an AI-generated voice. Anthropic sued the Trump administration Monday, calling on federal judges in San Francisco and Washington to strike down a government order forbidding military contractors from partnering with the artificial intelligence company on the grounds that it poses a risk to national security. These actions are unprecedented and unlawful, the company's attorneys wrote in the San Francisco case. The Constitution does not allow the government to wield its enormous power to punish a company for its protected speech. The Defense Department last week formally tagged the AI company as a supply chain risk, the kind of label usually reserved for Chinese and Russian firms suspected of helping foreign spies. The move followed increasingly bitter negotiations over how the company's technology might be used in warfare, with Anthropic seeking guarantees that the Claude model would not be used for mass domestic surveillance or to power fully autonomous weapons. The unprecedented step by the Pentagon came even as Anthropic's tools were playing a central role in President Donald Trump's bombing campaign in Iran. The Pentagon declined to comment on the lawsuit. In legal filings, Anthropic said the administration had overstepped its legal authority and violated the company's First Amendment rights to speak about the limits of AI's military applications. The company filed 2 cases to challenge 2 different laws the government is using to declare it a risk. Anthropic was founded based on the belief that AI technologies should be developed and used in a way that maximizes positive outcomes for humanity, and its primary animating principle is that the most capable artificial intelligence systems should also be the safest and the most responsible, the company's attorneys wrote in a complaint filed in U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California. Anthropic brings this suit because the federal government has retaliated against it for expressing that principle. Mark Gia, a law professor at Georgetown University, said Anthropic had a strong chance of success in court because the law the Defense Department is relying on was designed to target companies linked to foreign adversaries. It is absurd for the government to argue that Anthropic is the kind of company meant to be addressed by this statute, when the War Department has repeatedly sought to obtain Anthropic's services for national defense, Gia said in an email, referring to the department by the Trump administration's preferred name. The battle has reverberated through Silicon Valley, raising questions about what limits AI developers should be able to impose on their technology when they do.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and stop it here. We pretty much get the gist. I actually think that this Frost says that this is like War Games 1984-ish. It kind of is. You know, if you want to think about spheres of influence and that sort of thing. So I think it's going to get more 1984-ish. And then, of course, Hegseth and Trump can't even get their stories straight. This administration is turning out to be quite the clown car. And by the way, I have a short here that I released this morning, and it has ruffled some MAGA feathers. I thought it might get 1,000 views, but it looks stalled out at about 740. But let's play this short right quick. It's not very long, but it packed a punch. It had like 400 views in the first 30 minutes. This motherfucker is at a Congressional Medal of Honor ceremony talking about the drapes. Holy cow. What in the fuck? This motherfucker is talking about redecorating the White House at a Congressional Medal of Honor ceremony? Sheesh.
When that comes down right now, you see a very, very deep hole.
This motherfucker, yeah, this it wasn't very long. I actually didn't expect to get this kind of reaction to it, but it was genuine, somewhere between surprise and disgust. You know, you're here handing out Congressional Medals of Honor, and this dude's fucking talking about the color of the drapes that he wants to use for the ballroom. It's frankly disgusting and disrespectful. So I had to do a short on it. Well, surprise, surprise, surprise. After slashing federal jobs, Trump administration ramps up hiring. The hiring push is unfolding under new rules designed to give the White House greater influence over the government's 2 million person civilian workforce. So, says here, a year after Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency allies purged hundreds of thousands of federal employees, the Trump administration is ramping up hiring, a reversal that reflects a quiet retreat from one of the president's defining early priorities and marks a new phase in efforts to reshape the bureaucracy in his image. We probably have some skills that we now need to hire back, quite frankly, Scott Cooper, the head of the Office of Personnel Management, said in an interview with the Washington Post. There's no question anytime you do restructurings, sometimes you over restructure, sometimes you under restructure. So Trump is basically going to hire people back, but I'm guessing expertise will not be, at the top of the list of qualities they'll be looking for. Probably will be looking for, it wouldn't surprise me if there was some sort of loyalty oath or loyalty test required. So let us move on. So this is kind of an odd thing. This is Texas. If you'll recall, Ken Paxton virtually tied with damn it, what's his name? I can't even think of the dude's name. The incumbent. Somebody remind me of the incumbent, the incumbent senator that Ken Paxton primaried. It'll come to me in a minute, I guess. But anyway, Texas's Republican primary might come to an end after Attorney General Ken Paxton announced he'd consider dropping out of the Senate race if Congress passes the Save America Act. The move effectively turns his bid into a bargaining chip to implement a focal point of Trump's agenda, which is basically Trump has manufactured the crisis of non-citizens voting in federal elections, which is non-existent. But they're going to say they're going to act like it actually happens. So these MAGA guys are just all around bad eggs. So last week, some woman fired bullets into Rihanna's LA house, and apparently she's been identified and booked for attempted murder with a $10 million bail. So the woman who allegedly shot at Rihanna's Beverly Hills mansion on Sunday afternoon has been identified as 35-year-old Ivana Ortiz. Police confirmed Ortiz was arrested for attempted murder by the Los Angeles Police Department on Sunday. She's currently being held in LAPD Metropolitan Detention Center, and bail set, as I said, at $10 million. We previously reported the suspect used, an AR-15 style rifle to fire bullets at Rihanna's $14 million home, where she lives with her partner, A$AP Rocky, and their 3 kids. Their kids are RZA, Riot Rose, and 5-month-old Rocky Irish Mayers. Jeez. Police responded to the report of the shooting at 1:21 p.m. Sunday and quickly, it was this week. I thought it was last week. And quickly took Ortiz into custody. LA Times reported that the police dispatch revealed approximately 10 shots were fired from a vehicle, a white Tesla, across the street from the residence. Wow. And that's a picture of the gun, of the assault rifle. And a motive for the shooting is unknown. All right. Well, that is a strange occurrence. Who would have a problem with Rihanna? All right. So this is the obligatory science story brought to you by EAE, wherever he is. I've been playing him on Words with Friends, but I haven't seen him around these parts in a while. So says here, NASA's DART impact altered asteroid's orbit around the sun. Study finds. So published March 6th in Science Advances, researchers reported the Didymus dimorphos system's velocity decreased by roughly 11.7 micrometers per second after the DART impact. NASA's DART spacecraft rammed Dimorphos in September 2022, and impact ejecta acted like an extra rocket plume, roughly doubling the momentum transfer with a beta parameter near 2. No idea what that means. Using 22 stellar calculations and nearly 6,000 ground-based astrometric measurements, researchers detected the orbit shrank by about 1,200 feet and 0.15 seconds. That's I guess the velocity. Despite the tiny change, teams emphasize Earth remains safely out of the asteroid's path, and the study advances planetary defense planning with European Space Agency's Hera spacecraft arriving later this year. Questions remain about the impact's precise contributions, and researchers say Hera spacecraft survey later this year will clarify Dimorphos' post-impact shape and mass, while scientists note small early impulses can accumulate over years. Huh. Interesting. So everybody, please make sure that you have hit the like button. And if you happen to be new to the channel, please subscribe to it. Check us out, Kick the Tires. We may be your cup of tea. We may not be your cup of tea. But we have a new subscriber, the famous and lovely Bomb Cherry. So welcome to her if she's listening. And support the show by supporting the host. And we have the usual bills. The newspaper subscriptions, the Substack subscriptions, the YouTube subscriptions, and the StreamYard subscription. So any help is certainly appreciated. And don't forget the Sovereign Beer Fund. It may be opened early this week. I have a feeling it's going to be one of those weeks. So by the way, the bread in the thumbnail that for the show, today's show, it's actually bread I baked today. It is a 100% sprouted whole wheat loaf. And I've been trying to get a whole wheat sourdough loaf successfully for 2 months now. And I finally got one fairly close to where I need it to be. They're never gonna rise like a processed wheat would, like a bread flour loaf would, but it's not too bad, not too shabby. So let us see what else. Before I get into videos, I wanted to have a look at what the Washington Examiner has and also what the LA Times have. Anything interesting? Here's a picture of the New York bombing suspects who pledged allegiance to ISIS. Apparently, they were fleeing police. And oh man, look at these police chasing them down. Interesting. Let's see what else is in here. Hillary Clinton deposition. Khamenei's son. He's a handsome fella. And let's see. Let's have a look at the LA Times. I should be, for some reason, I'm not getting news alerts from these two newspapers. Let's see here. Anything interesting? Nothing too much. Nothing too much. Wow, former Whittier officer pleads guilty in shooting that left unarmed man paralyzed. Wow. So this woman that shot up Rihanna's house is from Florida. So she came all the way to Florida, all the way from Florida to shoot up Rihanna's house. Man, that is interesting. All right. Well, I guess there's nothing that interesting here. So I do have some videos for us. The first video, oops, that's not what I wanted. Sorry about that. Oh, did I not save? Damn it. You know what? Well, let's do this. I want to watch this this history thing from Ted Sturmer, my third favorite male historian. And then we're going to hear from J.D. Vance. He delivered remarks at the International Association of Firefighters. And then we're going to talk about Western culture. So let the fun begin.
There is a habit in American political culture that is so ingrained, it has stopped looking like a choice. Maybe it stopped being a choice. When something is wrong, when the government does something that would be called tyranny in any other context on the planet, when institutions designed to check power fail to check it, when the people who are supposed to say this is wrong cannot bring themselves to say it, the first move is never to say it. The first move is to find a founder who agrees with whatever it is you want to say. And that's doing us some real harm. Hey folks, I'm Ted Sturmer. I'm the author of Resistance History of the United States, and it so turns out, next, a public history of the American Revolution. So what happens when the Trump regime runs roughshod over the rule of law like every day? Someone rushes every day to remind us that George Washington believed in the rule of law. What happens when the regime abuses the Constitution? Again, a day ending in a Y. We're reminded that James Madison worried about executive overreach. We're told that Thomas Jefferson said, and then whatever Jefferson said gets recruited to authorize a conclusion the speaker was probably already inclined to reach, but spared the work of reaching it themselves. The founder becomes a permission slip. He, and there are always a he unless it's Abigail Adams, represents a way of holding a position without actually owning it. A kind of escape hatch from the present into a past that has been sanitized, fresh and clean from all the stains, for exactly that use. And the people who use the founders that way are not doing it because they have studied the founding closely, or if they have, they spend a lot of time ignoring it. because they're reaching instead for a set of nationalist fables, some bedtime stories 2 centuries in the making, producing characters we call the founders that are specifically designed to be used in just that way. Complicated enough to feel honest and relatable, redeemable enough to authorize deference and generate sympathy, tragic enough to make the original design feel like a promise rather than a choice. All of it to make you feel better about your national identity and whatever your political leaders are using their words to get you to do that you might not otherwise do. Now, the cottage industry doing all of that work is currently in a boom cycle, right? The 250th is here. The books are landing and will keep coming, dear God. The documentaries are airing, and all of them are running the same kind of weird psychoanalysis, a kind of therapy to extract the private conscience from the public record, to hold the intentions up and call that the real man, ignoring the actions. The troubled founder, the impossible position, the private anguish, the belated redemption, always got to be the redemption. The whole genre has a grammar now. And the product is always, always, always the same. A founder you can still use, whose words can guide you from the grave. So let's look at how that product gets manufactured. Because if you can see it clearly in one case, you start to see it everywhere. And once you start to see it everywhere, you just can't unsee it. Today's case is George Washington and slavery, and specifically the claim stated constantly in classrooms and documentaries and op-eds and threads and TikTok and Instagram, all produced by people who should know better but don't want you to know any better, that Washington freed his slaves in his will. Except he didn't. Washington freed one enslaved person in any immediate, meaningful sense, the sense that would have mattered to them. His name, and I'm sure it mattered to him, was William Lee. He was Washington's personal attendant, and he received what the will called immediate freedom. The other 122 men, women, and children Washington enslaved were not freed. Their liberty was deferred, their freedom entirely contingent on the death of Martha Washington, which meant that the day George Washington died, 122 people woke up enslaved and went to sleep enslaved and would continue to do so until Martha chose to act or she stopped breathing. The 153 dour enslaved people brought into the marriage from the Custis estate weren't Washington's to free at all, so that's not part of this. So the question that cuts through everything is pretty simple. It's not complicated. It doesn't require volumes of books in order to explain all that complexity about them to you. How many people were more free the day after George Washington died than on the day before? 1. How many weren't? All the rest. So 1. There's a whole number you need to know. That's not complicated. It's a single digit. Everything else is just a commentary on a number that cannot move. Now, the nationalists on the right and left who defend Washington just start with the commentary on it. Because if you accept that a few private expressions, a few, are the measure of someone's entire moral character that just change on a grand scale over the course of his life. So Washington is acquitted before the evidence comes in. These people are always fighting in their corner. So he told Robert Morris in 1786, that there was not a man living who wished more sincerely for abolition. He told Lafayette that gradual emancipation certainly might and assuredly ought to be effected. He regularly stated the standard with complete clarity. And then he spent the rest of his life, the rest of his time, making sure the cost of meeting that standard, slavery bad, would land somewhere other than on him. He inherited enslaved people, purchased more, structured his entire financial life around the stolen lives of those people, and then when pressed on the gap between what he ostensibly believed and what he in fact did about it, cited the dependence he had constructed on those people as the reasons he couldn't do anything about it. The obstacle was not legal impossibility or political impossibility in any absolute sense. By his own accounting, the obstacle was money. Freeing those people would have required the restructuring of assets, a less extravagant estate. His life at Mount Vernon was one of extraordinary privilege and comfort. He lacked nothing. He chose to lack nothing. And he wasn't about to start lacking nothing just to free the people whose lives gave him that comfort. So his will deferred the freedom of 122 people to suit the comfort of one woman, Martha. They would serve her for as long as she required it, in addition to the 153 slave people of her own, and not do that anymore when her household just no longer needed them. That's when the promise to them would come due. And so Washington structured their freedom as a remainder interest in his estate, something left over after the people he actually cared about had been taken care of. Now, Martha did free Washington's enslaved people about a year after his death because, go figure, she feared that people waiting for her to die in order to be free might be motivated to hasten that outcome. Abigail Adams talked about it. Washington's arrangement had actually created the conditions in which the people he claimed to want free had every rational incentive to want Martha dead. That's a dark kind of comedy based on tragedy. And it's a priority structure that placed his comfort and then Martha's comfort above the freedom of 122 people until there was no one left to bear the cost but them. And man of his time does not rescue him. God spare me, because his time already contained the evidence that another choice was available. Pennsylvania had a gradual abolition law in the books in 1780. While he was president in Washington, we all know this story. It's part of one of the chapters in my book. Washington arranged for his enslaved household to be rotated back to Mount Vernon before they could claim freedom under it, instructing Tobias Lear that it should be done under, and this is a quote, and I have it tattooed on my heart, under the pretext that may deceive both them and the public. And this is a story that never gets told, though it's in the book too. His attorney general, Edmund Randolph, used that same Pennsylvania law to free his enslaved people and took the financial hit he knew was coming. Washington was not trapped by his time. He was just navigating it with considerable precision. And he was navigated in the direction that preserved everything he had. But Washington is not a special case. He's just a clear case. And the same method runs through all of it. Benjamin Franklin, right? Franklin enslaved people for most of his adult life and benefited financially from slavery for decades. He wrote this 1751 essay, which asked explicitly why America should increase the sons of Africa rather than exclude all blacks and tawnies in favor of the lovely white and red. It wasn't a fringe position, stated plainly as a kind of common sense for him and his white buddies. He almost certainly continued to own enslaved people through the Revolutionary War. His anti-slavery activity began in the 1780s, after Pennsylvania law had already done something else about it. And the petition he signed in 1790 as president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society was tabled by Congress in 2 weeks after Washington told him it wasn't going to go anywhere anyway. And then he dies 2 months later. Now, nationalist history makes of that sequence a redemption arc. The arc bends. He got there eventually, just like America will. It's the same mechanism you use for Washington, you use for all the rest. Take the late, limited gesture, inflate it into a defining identity, and then let it retroactively reframe everything before. They were getting there. What the redemption narratives are protecting is not Washington specifically or Franklin specifically, but the fiction that the founders were working towards something the country has simply been slow to complete. That if you're patient and deferential and willing to work within the original design, the system contains the tools for its own correction. Everything will eventually get better. Just be patient and don't push too hard. Don't resist. That's why it matters now, and why the lie is not harmless. The managed story of the founding does not just misread the past. It produces a specific political posture in the present. The trained reflex of reaching for a dead man before confronting a living one, of asking what Washington would have thought before asking what you think, of being unable to call something wrong until a founder can be made to nod along with it. It teaches deference where clarity is needed. It turns moral judgment into ancestor worship. And it makes the present nearly impossible to confront on its own terms, because the people who have been most thoroughly trained in that habit are precisely the people who are going to have to confront it. The founders are not historical figures in American political culture. They're alive. They're active political instruments. They're wielded in arguments about what the government owes you and what you owe the government, about whether resistance is legitimate, about whether the system is salvageable or was built wrong from the start. Do you just want to reframe your house if it's falling down around you, or do you want a new one? Nope, can't possibly think about a new one. Let's go ahead and get to work on that house. The resistance history of the founding produces the recognition that the tools were also designed to prevent correction, that the people who built the system built it to serve specific interests, and that the tension between those interests and the interests of everyone else has never actually been resolved. It's only been contained, which is, as it turns out, exactly what Washington did with slavery. And the fit for the day, the Resistance t-shirt, is from the center of the first American resistance, Old North Church in Boston. Go to them online to get yours today. And that's all I've got, folks. 2F by C.
All right. Well, it's always interesting how the same events can be interpreted differently. And he's absolutely right. President Washington literally hunted Ona Judge from the president's office. So, our first president was also the first enslaver in chief, and he was also a slave hunter in chief. And there's not much that can, contradict that fact. There's really no way to explain it away. Therefore, they don't want you to know about it. That's pretty much how, high school history is taught, at least. And frankly, I can't remember. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure I took political science and I took like a world history. It was kind of like a world history / anthropology course. I can't remember if I took US history in college. I'd have to go back and look. Whatever it wasn't memorable, obviously. All right, so let's see. What is next? Next is our wonderful Vice President J.D. Vance delivering an address to the national. Is it National Firefighters? Something or another. International Association of Firefighters. And it's about a 19 or so minute speech.
To welcome Vice President J.D. Vance to the International Association of Firefighters 2026 Legislative Conference. Vice President Vance has stood with the IFF on issues that matter most to firefighters and their families. When the passage of the Honoring Our Fallen Heroes Act was in jeopardy this winter, the White House made it clear that they would stand with the families of our fallen, and they went to work. The White House removed every stumbling block that was put in our way. Occupational cancer is now recognized as a line of duty death, and federal death and education benefits are given to the families of our fallen because the Trump-Vance administration's steadfast support got it there. The administration has also backed our federal firefighters, protecting the collective bargaining rights of our 16th district members. As a senator, Vice President Vance was a strong supporter of the Social Security Fairness Act. After the 2024 election, when he was vice president-elect, he returned to Washington and urged his Senate colleagues to pass the bill restoring dignity in retirement for millions of public servants. He supported the reauthorization of AFG and SAFER grants, programs that help fire departments hire firefighters and keep their communities safe. After the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, Senator Vance worked with the IFF and rail safety unions on the Railway Safety Act, bipartisan legislation to strengthen rail safety and improve hazmat training for firefighters. Before entering public office, then Corporal Vance served this country honorably in the United States Marine Corps, including a tour in Iraq. Brothers and sisters, please join me in welcoming Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance.
The last time he played this song at an event, I actually got a little warning, a little flag, so I had to go in and erase the actual song.
This is a very big group. I can't see any of you because these spotlights are glaring bright. The person who runs these spotlights, Ed, must be a Democrat because I cannot see a single person in that crowd. But I'm told there's about 700 of you out there, and so I say to everybody, whether it's a small school group or 700 great firefighters from all across our country, that this is your nation's capital. This is your capital. Your tax dollars built these beautiful monuments and museums, and I know you got a lot of work to do while you're here in Washington, but I hope each and every one of you gets to enjoy this beautiful city, especially as the weather turns really nice here in Washington, D.C. Now, the one bad thing about the weather is when it starts to get warm, you know, as a politician, we're gearing up for political campaign season. And I'm probably as sick of politics as you all are. So that's the one downside. But I hope you enjoy this beautiful spring weather and enjoy your nation's capital while you're here. We're thrilled to have you. And I just want to say thank you so much to Ed and to the entire team at the International Association of Firefighters. Ed Kelly has been a great advocate for you and for firefighters all across the United States of America. In fact, when we met backstage very briefly, we talked a little bit about some of the great legislative accomplishments of the Trump administration, and we'll talk a bit about that here in a second. But then the second half of the conversation was Ed trying to shake me down even more. He was trying to think, what else can we get out of this administration? And I love that. I love a guy who fights for his people. I love a firefighter who knows he stands for and represents firefighters. And I hope all of you know that we're going to work with you over the next few years to continue to solve the problems that exist for our firefighting community. One of the things that a lot of you know about this administration and hopefully appreciate about this administration, but I'm going to make my pitch here, is that we have been unique among Republicans in that we haven't turned away organized labor. We have tried to find ways to work with organized labor. Not that we're always going to agree, but another great Bostonian, Sean O'Brien, the head of the Teamsters Union, we found ways to work together to serve working people. And there is no group of people that is harder working and more important for our community than our firefighters. And so thank you all for being here, and thank you for honoring me by inviting me to give you a few remarks today. Now, before I get into some of my other remarks, I want to just start on a slightly somber note here, because on a personal level, I was honored to be able to participate in the dignified transfer of 6 American soldiers who were killed overseas in this conflict with Iran. And I had never done that before. And a lot of you served our nation in uniform. I know a number of our firefighters have all across our country. And I just want to say that if you are the praying type, and I certainly am, I hope you'll spare a prayer for the 6 souls that we lost, for the 7th soul who will be coming home tonight, and for all of their families. You all know better than almost any category of Americans what it means to put on a uniform and to sacrifice for our country. And so I hope you'll share a moment of prayer for our brothers in arms, for your brothers in arms who keep this country safe in their own way, just as you keep the country safe in your particular way. So, to move on a little bit, let me just say that what we have tried to do in the Trump administration, what we have tried to accomplish is to make your lives easier, knowing, of course, that we're never going to be able to make your lives completely easy. You guys have some of the hardest jobs that exist anywhere in the United States of America, and you represent thousands and thousands of firefighters all across the United States of America who make it possible for our communities to be safe, who make it possible for our communities to run smoothly, who make it possible for a kid to be able to call 911 if they have to, and know that a man or a woman who is professional, who is competent, and who is caring is going to show up when we need them. And that's the thing that I admire so much about all of you. You know, every country, every empire, every society in history made it possible for a rich person to get what they needed. But what makes the United States so unique is that whether you're rich or poor, you're black or white, when you need public services, when you need your police officers, when you need your firefighters, when you need those EMT specialists, we make it, and we try hard to make it so that everybody who needs something in that critical moment has access to it. Everybody deserves public safety, not just rich people. Every person deserves to know that if, God forbid, their house catches on fire, there's going to be somebody with water there to put it out, not just the powerful. And what I admire about this spirit of public service that exists in this community is that every single one of you put on a uniform, the people that you serve put on a uniform and make it possible for kids like me kids who didn't grow up with a silver spoon in their mouth to have access to that critical public safety and that security in their neighborhoods. Now, a lot of you, I came and spoke in Boston a couple of years ago, and so what I say may come, you may have heard me say it in Boston, but I'm going to repeat it for those of you who didn't hear me say it in Boston, which is that, a couple times I was one of those scared little kids who had to call the firefighters, who had to call the EMTs. My own mother struggled with opioid addiction for a very large chunk of my life. And I remember when she was having a particularly dark moment and she needed some help. I needed some help. Our family needed some help. I picked up the phone, I called 911, and a number of brave, professional, compassionate firefighters from Middletown, Ohio showed up. And they calmed my mom down, and they made it possible for us to go on with the rest of our day. They made a kid who was scared to death feel like he had an ally in this world. I will never forget that. I will never forget also when we had to call 911, it wasn't a firefighter, it was an EMT who came and took my mom to the hospital because she had had a very terrible overdose. And I remember holding her hand, hoping to God that she would be okay, that she would wake up. We know a lot of our people have not woken up when they have those opioid overdoses, but by the grace of God, my mom did wake up. And by the way, she's now been clean and sober for north of 11 years. We celebrated her 10-year sobriety. Thank you. We celebrated her 10 years of sobriety in the West Wing of the White House. What an incredible testament to the American dream that a woman I thought would never live to meet my children is now the best grandmother to those children that they could ever ask for. And we celebrated that sobriety in the People's White House. But that moment, the many moments of second chances that we've gotten with my mom, and I love you, Mom, if you're watching this. She probably is. She watches everything. I don't know why, but she does. But Mom, we would not have gotten that second chance were it not for the firefighters all across our country, for the EMT specialists all across our country who make it possible for second chances again and again and again. What you guys do is not easy. And as you all know, it doesn't always pay as well as it should, but it does give people, millions of Americans all across this nation, a sense that somebody is looking out for them. And that's one of the reasons why I love what you do, why I'm so honored to be here, is because you are the glue that holds so many of American communities together. I talked a little bit about the folks that we lost in Iran, and we're so thankful for their service and so hopeful that nobody else comes home having lost their life. But I think there's a brotherhood, a sisterhood between the military, the police officers, and the firefighters, because you are the three categories of people who put on a uniform and put your lives at risk for your communities. You got different jobs. You have different roles to play. But I think it's an amazing testament to our country, maybe the single most important resource that we have as a United States of America, is that every single one of you is willing to sacrifice your life. Hopefully you never will, but every single one of you is willing to sacrifice your life for this great country and for the people that you serve in your communities. I just want you to know, from the President of the United States, but from everybody, I think I can say comfortably, even in partisan and difficult times, that I represent the whole country when I say to all of our members of the International Association of Firefighters, we are thankful to you, we are proud of you, we love you, and we're going to do everything that we can to support you. Now, let me talk just a little bit about what it means to really support you, because I think it's important. It's of course important that the vice president stand up here and say how grateful he is, and I certainly am. I'm grateful to each and every one of you and the people you serve, but it's not just about words, it's about action. And that's one of the things I'm proudest about this administration, is that we have actually backed up the pride and the support and the gratitude that we have for all of you with very meaningful action. You heard Ed talk a little bit about the Social Security Fairness Act. Well, one of the reasons why that happened is because the President of the United States, and I believe it was even before the inauguration, the President of the United States made sure that congressional Republicans stayed on top of that legislation and we worked to get it done. That happened because of presidential leadership. Do you think Joe Biden was making those phone calls, ladies and gentlemen? I just got to say, I don't think so. Sorry, I got a little partisan there. But we owe it to Americans who suffered through exposure to toxic chemicals, especially the first responders who seek to protect others from harm. We owe it to you to actually look after you and to take care of you. In that vein, one of the first pieces of legislation I ever worked on was the Railway Safety Act. And I'll never forget your support in making that act a possibility. We actually got it, by the way, into the most recent transportation package. I'm sure Ed and all of you will use your very able lobbying and persuasion tactics to make sure that that legislation actually becomes law. Because here's the thing. When I met the firefighters who dealt with that terrible train derailment in East Palestine, one of the things that I picked up is, they weren't angry. They weren't mad. That was their job. They went into a very dangerous situation because that was their job and that's what they expect to do. But they were worried about one thing. What might happen with all these toxic chemicals that were in the air? Would they have long-term problems? Would they suffer some consequences? And one of the things that Secretary Kennedy and I worked on is making sure that we are studying the long-term effects of toxic chemical exposure in East Palestine. We appropriated millions of dollars, and trust me, when I was a senator, I worked to get that money from the last administration just to understand the effects of toxic chemical exposure over time. And we didn't have that until this administration came along and Secretary Kennedy made it a priority, because we want you all to know, if God forbid you run into harm's way, what are the consequences going to be to you over the long haul? And importantly, what are the kinds of medical treatments that you're going to need if you're in that situation, to make sure that the sacrifice that you make in the line of duty doesn't become more than it has to be? Those are the kinds of tangible steps that we are trying to take. Now, we know that President Kelly and President Trump, we all have our own presidents, my friends. He was a huge proponent, and I'm glad for this, of the Honoring Our Fallen Heroes Act. Now, that was critically important legislation that you all know President Trump signed into law just a few months ago. Now, as Ed can tell you, this law extends legal benefits for firefighters and first responders who pass away from cancers caused by exposure in the line of duty. Now, when one of you becomes ill or, God forbid, loses your life because of cancer that was developed in the line of duty, their families are entitled to federal benefits that they earned. It's a big one. Now, I say they already earned them because we owe it to Americans who suffered through exposure to toxic chemicals, especially the first responders who go into harm's way to protect others from harm. That is what this administration is all about. Making sure that the Social Security system treats you fairly, making sure that you get the benefits, or if God forbid you pass away, your families get the benefits that you deserve, making sure that we take care of the people who take care of us. That is the legacy of the Trump administration when it comes to our firefighters, and that is a legacy that we're going to keep on building on over the next 3 years of President Trump's leadership. Now, I want to close with a very simple point. This is an administration that is fighting first and foremost for working men and women. I talked about that a little bit at the beginning. We're especially fighting for working men and women who serve the public interest, and that's what all of you do. When I was a little kid, I wanted to be a United States Marine. Some kids want to be doctors. Other kids want to be teachers. Some want to be astronauts, but it's, as you know, a lot of little kids all across our country, they want to be firefighters. That's a great testament to the work that you do every single day. I guess my point here is that every kid in our country has dreams, and those dreams come in many shapes and sizes. And what I want most of all is for your service and your sacrifice to be rewarded by all of us living in a country where you don't have to be rich or lucky to obtain the American dream. You just got to have a little grit, a little determination, and a lot of hard work. I want all of us, your kids and mine, to live in safe neighborhoods. I want us to send our kids to good schools. I want our families to not have to live paycheck to paycheck. And that's why our administration is fighting for all the policies that we've been fighting for, from the low crime to reversing the inflation of the Biden years, because we want every single person in our community to be able to live a good life. What is the work of all of you, of our firefighters and our EMTs, if it's not to ensure that every kid has an opportunity to live in safety and security? You do your part every single day, and I'm proud of you for it. But that means that we've got to honor your service by doing our part here in Washington, D.C. So let me just say that all of you deserve to live in this great country, and all of us in this administration are proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with you as we rebuild the United States of America. I want you to be proud in your country, because I know that your country and your president are very, very proud of you, and we're grateful to you. Thanks everybody, and God bless you.
Well, that was a lot of nothing said. I'm fairly impressed. Excuse me. Let's have a look at this before we get into something serious. This just happened to wander into my algorithm, and you'll see why in just a minute.
There was a really sweet older Black lady who sent me an email after my HGTV episode aired, and she said I was the Harriet Tubman of tiny houses. And obviously she and I know I haven't done anything, as amazing as Miss Tubman, but I understood her point in that I was opening something up to Black people that we previously may not have been considering, and that it was likely the first time that a lot of Black people were seeing someone Black living in a tiny house. My name is Jewel Pearson. I am a tiny house consultant, advocate, and dweller. I decided to make tiny house living my lifestyle in 2013 when I stumbled on another woman's story about building her own tiny house. Her story resonated with me, and then it just kind of made sense to me as far as building home. So I started researching and then started designing my house, and that was kind of how I just decided that this was what I was going to do. My tiny house is 28 feet long. It's about 9.5 feet wide. It's more of an open space. It doesn't really have rooms per se, but I have 2 overhead lofts. One of the lofts is my bedroom. One is seating space with plants and things. It could be a second bedroom if someone needed to utilize it. I have a full bathroom that includes a tub, washer dryer combo, a flush style toilet. I have a full living space with a very comfortable couch. That was kind of important to me as I was designing my house, so that comfort was always at the top of my list. I have a full walk-in closet, which was also on my must-have list. And I have what I consider like a galley-style kitchen. Cooking isn't on the top of my favorite list, but I do have enough space to cook a meal, and it works very functionally. And then just recently, I added a sunroom space. So altogether, with the new sunroom space, my house is about 480 square feet if you don't count the 2 overhead lofts. It took me about 6 months to find someone to build my tiny house design. I was building and researching again around 2014. So tiny houses are popular now, but when I was building and researching, people really thought I was crazy. So when I was having conversations with builders and I was trying to really work with a Black builder, It was older builders, and there were several times I'd have a meeting with them, and I'd talk to them about, I need to build this house on a 28-foot trailer, and the conversation would end because they say, well, that can't be done. And it's like, I know it can be done. I've got some examples of it being done. And so it was just the fact that not many people were able to think out of the box at that time and really conceptualize what I was trying to do. The downsizing process and getting into a smaller space was not difficult for me because I had the luxury of doing it kind of over the process over 10 years. I downsized initially from a 4-bedroom, 3-bath house, and then over the course of 10 years, right before I built my tiny house, I was living in a 1-bedroom, 1-bath. So by that time, I'd pared down to, all of my favorite things. And I do have a storage. I still feel like, I don't consider myself a minimalist, but I still am saving in what I pay for parking as well as, a small storage unit. My tiny house operates very much like an RV. So I get my water and electricity from an existing structure that's already on the property. With the cities and counties not necessarily allowing tiny houses, it's very difficult to place a tiny house on a piece of property solely by itself. And they, most likely are not going to allow you to have water and electricity just for a tiny house. So I always am locating my house on a piece of property where there's already an existing structure, and then I get my power and my water from that structure. My tiny house cost me about $85,000 out of pocket. And again, I was building in late 2014, early 2015. I did have some sponsors. So some of the material was sponsored. Some of the items in the house were sponsored. And when I say that, out of pocket, it was $85,000, I always have the people who say, oh, I could buy a house for that amount. And then I always point out that it's not really comparing apples to apples because that was $85,000 out of pocket, not a 15 or 30-year mortgage with interest. So that as that you pay $85,000, it ends up being 2-3 times, that amount overall by the time you finish that loan. So it was, $85,000 and I own my house. And what I do, is pay for parking for my house. So one of the main questions that's always asked is it, where am I going to park my tiny house? Is it hard to find a parking location for your tiny house? And that is one of the major challenges for tiny house living because most cities and counties don't have rules around tiny houses. They're often not very accepting of tiny houses. So that is a challenge. For me, I always felt like it was something that I'd work out, like it didn't stop me from building. I've had the most success in finding my locations through Craigslist, actually, and then word of mouth. But there are plenty of Facebook pages and groups in different cities that assist people who are looking for locations for tiny houses. One of the things that I have been working on is what I call cooperative communities, and that is an opportunity for Black farmers, Black landowners, and property owners who would be interested in allowing Black people who live in tiny houses or who are considering tiny houses in the future would allow.
I have to look it up. I think there's a tiny house community in Atlanta somewhere. Seems like a while ago. I remember seeing a video on the topic.
Allow them to park their tiny house on their property. And so it's kind of like a matching service that it helps the farmer and the property owner financially because we know that Black farmers are losing their land at astronomical rates. So it helps them financially, might even help them with the person there being able to assist them physically with some of the work on the farm. And then it's providing that Black tiny house owner a place for parking so that they know that they're safe and secure. So if I had to identify the worst thing about tiny house living, I would probably say it's about having a place to put it. I am about 40 minutes east of a major city. I would prefer to be, I'm a city girl, so I would absolutely prefer to be in the city. I would prefer to be in an urban area. So until that is something that changes, that is probably the worst thing about tiny house living. And for me, the best thing about tiny house living is that I have really been able to design my lifestyle. I always say that this is my retirement plan. And so with living in a tiny house, I want to be able to make decisions based on desires versus, needs, having to, make a job decision based on, the bills that I have to pay. I don't want to be in those type situations anymore. And so for me, the best thing about tiny house living is the opportunity to just kind of design your life. So I offer virtual tiny house tours and consultations. The tours are what I say for people who are interested in tiny houses and just kind of want to experience a tiny house. So I offer a tour. And then for someone who is, more sure that this is something that they want to do, then I offer a consultation, a one-on-one consultation to help them, figure out navigating the entire process. And then I also offer workshops. And so workshops, I consider them like Tiny House 101, which is the basics. And then a 201 that gets more into the building specifics. And then there's also a workshop for placement, how to go about finding a location for your tiny house. I think it's important for our community to see tiny house living as an opportunity for us. And so if people feel like I'm the pioneer or the trailblazer, I accept that with honor, because I've wanted us to see that, my tagline is you don't have to give up luxury to go tiny. So I've wanted us to be able to see this as a viable option for us outside of conventional home ownership. And so I take that and smile.
Yeah, like I said, that just kind of wandered into my algorithm. So I subscribed to her page, and you can see her here. She's grown. This is a month ago, so her hair's like afro length right now. Let's see here. Trump had a press conference, which I may save till tomorrow. Yeah, I actually want to see this since I've been studying up on liberalism and conservatism. I figured we would watch this. And if I recall, Alan Guelzo, what do I know the name from? I think he might be one of the new right conservatives or something like that, or either that or he's one of the post liberalists. I can't remember, but let us find out together.
This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We have the perfect guest today to talk about the Epstein files and the recent Texas primary, but instead we're going to go a little bigger picture. This is his second appearance on essentially the same book, but it's volume 2, The Golden Thread, A History of the Western Tradition, the Modern and Contemporary West. So it starts in 1500 by our guest today, Alan Guelzo, and his co-author, James Hankins, who took the lead on the first volume, and Alan took the lead on this volume. I just had a very interesting conversation with him. He insists everything was written by him or by his co-author in the whole thing, which means he woke up one morning and said, okay, let me tackle Erasmus today, or the revolutions of 1848. And then tomorrow I'll do the cotton gin or whatever. But I want to be really clear. This is one of the most impressive physical books I've seen come out in years, maybe decades. It's a lovely book. The first one is lovely too. People know I encourage people to pick up the books of our authors who are on here, but I really this is a graduation present kind of thing. This is this is the kind of thing where you lock your wayward 14-year-old boy in a shack and with enough food and water and this book and say, don't come out until August. There are profiles of countless figures from Western history and the art, music, politics, obviously, philosophy, religion. It covers literally everything since 1500. It's it's the kind of book you can pick up at any time and just go down rabbit holes, and I like rabbit holes. So I cautioned Alan before we started talking that I always ask the guest what their book is about, but this is It's like asking a librarian, what are the books about in your library? Regardless, I'm still going to do it, and you can just take it any way you want. Alan Gelzer, what's your book about?
Well, it's about this thing that Jim Hankins and I call the Western tradition. The Western tradition, think of it as a layer cake. It is a layer cake of several civilizations, starting with civilization of the Greeks. Because volume 1 of the Golden Thread literally begins with the Greeks, begins with the Battle of Marathon. And we move successively through Greek civilization, Hellenic civilization, so to speak. And from there, we move to Roman civilization and how we moved upon the civilization of the Greeks. And then from there, we move into talking about medieval civilization, civilizational Christendom. And then that's the point at which the ball gets handed off to me, and I move into talking about the civilization of the Enlightenment. And then, in a sense, what I have to do is something that Jim did not have to do. Jim had the pleasure of rolling the stone up the hill and saying, all right, we start with the Greeks, we move up to the Romans, and so on like that through the times of Christendom. And then eventually, of course, to the Renaissance. I take over when the ball, so to speak, is on the top of the mountain. And now what I have to do is chart how in many ways the ball has rolled downwards. And especially since the Enlightenment, how serious questioning of this thing called the Western tradition has taken place, to the point where it has now become an issue discussed on platforms of state and diplomacy. And that is, what is this thing called Western civilization or the Western tradition? And are we in danger of losing it? Should we be worried about losing it? So let me crank those questions backwards. Should we be worried about you losing it? Yes, I think we definitely should be. We should be worried at anything that puts us on the edge of a new dark age, culturally speaking. And when you think of the Dark Ages, you think of primitivism, you think of barbarism, and you think, well, wait a minute, we live in a high-tech society. We live in a very comfortable society. We can't possibly slip back like that. And the answer is no, that's really not the issue. You can be a very high-tech barbarian, because a barbarian is not someone who simply wears skins and lives in a cave. A barbarian is a person who simply by definition has no larger cultural sites in life, believes that power is the chief motivating force in all human interactions, and has no respect for how people are manipulated, exploited, or used by others to achieve their own narcissistic ends. That's barbarism. And you can meet barbarism at any AI conference. That's not because AI is necessarily barbaric. It's simply because it doesn't require that you not be barbaric. So you can, in fact, discover barbarism, and you can discover its real threats. We have seen those threats, even in our own lifetime and the lifetime of our parents, when nations which otherwise had more remarkable cultural heritages. I think of Germany in the 20th century. This Germany was the culture of Bach. It was the culture of Brahms. It was the culture of marvelous things. And yet, what did it visit on the world twice in the 20th century? But catastrophes not only of unprecedented scope, but of unprecedented horror. You can be a barbarian, and you can be dressed in a suit and tie, because at root, a barbarian is someone who has abandoned this thing called civilization in the pursuit of something that they consider to be much more interesting and full of play for themselves. So yes, we should be worried about seeing this Western tradition slip through our fingers, because the alternative is a return to barbarism, even high-tech barbarism. You can have that as easily as you had the barbarisms of the 20th century. So this is an issue. And it's an issue not because necessarily our times are particularly vulnerable. There are repeated times in the history of the Western tradition when that civilizing power has almost slipped through our fingers. The Dark Ages were one example of this. We we survived that, so to speak, by the skin of our teeth, to borrow the famous chapter title from Kenneth Clark's Civilization. There have been other occasions in the time of the 14th century, the time of the Great Plague, when unspeakable percentages of the European population were simply wiped out by this deadly pandemic, the bubonic plague. Yeah, we teetered on the brink then too. We teetered on the brink in the 17th century as a result downstream of the religious wars that tore Europe to bits and imposed horrific casualty lists. So yes, there are more moments than just our moment when there have been challenges. So in a sense, it's not unique. Barbarism is a persistent human temptation. So what is the civilization of the West and what makes it unique that we want very badly to hold on to it? I think it's a composite of a number of things that we talked about in our first session. Government by law, debate for the sake of heaven, restraint, culture, music, religion, especially monotheistic religion. These are all aspects of this Western tradition which have been persistent from the time of the Greeks, moving up to our own day. Should we hold on to these things?
This dude is just smarmy. It's great that, you can be basically a Western chauvinist like this, but there needs to be some balance brought to this picture. Okay. What does he mean? It's possible we return to barbarism. When has Western civilization left barbarism? We have everything from the death penalty to, there's slavery, there's racism, there's all kinds of shit. There's nuclear war. This guy is painting too rosy a picture. I can't believe that he even suggests that we aren't barbarians in 2026. We're fighting a war currently in Iraq, and we're blowing up people suspected drug boats. How is that not barbarian?
Yes, because all of those things are moving parts of living within the Western tradition. Those are the moving parts to keep us from slipping back into barbarism. So the alternative is actually a stark one. We will, in fact, either hold on to the principles of Western civilization and the Western tradition, or we are going to slip into, as we have at almost completely at some moments, we will slip back into barbarisms. And we've seen what the costs are when that happens. So both books are one small way in which Hankins and I are, we're pulling the brake thing on the train, and we're saying, wait a minute, all right, hold on, stop, let's reflect on where we're going, because the bridge might be out a mile or so ahead of us.
So you're talking about barbarians, and I take your meaning, and I agree with it, but it calls to mind, there's a wonderful essay, can't remember the title of it, by John Courtney Murray from the 1960s, where he talks about the real threat from within. The real threat is idiots. And what he means by that is not mentally deficient people. He means it in the Greek sense, where the idiot is the person who is unacquainted with the requirements of civilized life, of civility, of civilization. And they just don't know what they don't know, and they don't care. And it doesn't mean they're not smart. It just means they see no higher purpose, I guess, is one way of putting it. And I think that I take your point about the barbarians, but it seems to me it's more of a coalition of barbarians and idiots than anything. But
there are some barbarians out there who are very talented, who are very well equipped, and who have the capacity to effect tremendous changes. Again, do not be bad. Just as John Courtney Murray talked about idiotes as being not just someone with single-digit IQs, but in fact someone who can think very clearly, but was thinking on the basis of the wrong principles or of no principles whatsoever.
Right.
So you can have people who are very effective thinkers, but if there is no principle built into what they're thinking about, then what is liable to happen as a result is going to look very much like a train wreck.
I don't want to jump ahead to
What's liable to happen is a Trump presidency.
philosophical pragmatism, but that's basically my critique of that. So in constitutional interpretation, I recently went down a rabbit hole on this. There's a debate about, the phrase text, history, and tradition. And someone posed the question, okay, as a matter of interpretation, what is the actual difference between history and tradition? Like, what does history do for you in that statement that tradition doesn't? Or what does tradition do for you in that statement that history doesn't? I want to ask sort of a similar question about this: is why tradition rather than civilization or history? Is it that what is the word tradition doing for you here that those other words wouldn't necessarily be doing?
Hankins and I use the word tradition here because we're quite literally borrowing from the Latin root traditio, the handing over. So what happens between the Greeks and the Romans and Christendom? It is a handing over. It is not a simple continuity. What we see in the civilization of medieval Christendom is simply not Athens, and it's certainly not Sparta. All right, there has been a handing over of a body of principles. Now, some of those principles that were lived by in the days of the Peloponnesian War, where we do not hand over, because those are not fundamental elements of this thing we call civilization, or the civilization of Greeks. But there is a handing over. All right, so we start with that initial layer, Greek civilization. There are certain things which are handed over to the Romans, in which the Romans are really quite shameless about appropriating in their own way. But they have to rename everything. And then what do we do when we move into the age of Christendom? Then we're talking about how we appropriate the classics. And one of the things which feeds, let us call it, civilization of the Renaissance, is a massive reappropriation that takes place of the classical heritage of Greece and Rome, especially of the Greeks, because at the same time as the last stand of the Byzantine Empire is taking place, there is this migration, a literal physical migration of scholars of Greek who are bringing that learning to Italy, bringing it to other points of the West, and they are almost physically handing over great texts which in Western Europe have been lost for a very long time. I mean, the recovery of Aristotle is a particularly good example this way. If you had asked people in Western Europe in, let's say, the year 800 or 900, if you'd asked questions about Aristotle, you probably would have gotten a blank look. What has to happen is you have, just to give an example, you have scholars like Manuel Chrysalis, who's a refugee from the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. He's bringing his mastery of Greek. He's reintroducing this to the West, and it's an intoxicating moment. This is where you get in Italy someone like Marsilio Ficino. Ficino is just on a roll with the recovery and the rediscovery of this Greek learning, of Greek literature, of the Greek classics. He even reinstitutes the celebrations of Plato's birthday. Now, I can't tell you exactly that we got Plato's birthday right on the calendar, but the point for Ficino was, here we have rediscovered something that had been lost here for a long time. It's being put back into our hands, and that is, in its own way, that is the most essential example of what we mean by tradition. It's handing over and over. You get something of a modern image of this in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, when the chief character in Fahrenheit 451 discovers these people in the woods. And he's the fireman who is rebelled against burning books. He's come to the conclusion, I'm doing the wrong thing. I've got to find something else to do. I've got to get away from here. He finds these people in the woods. What are these people in the woods doing? They're memorizing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, according to Bradbury, they've got this special trick that allows them to do perfect memorization. All right, well, Bradbury doesn't explain that. I wish he would patent it. My would make life easier. But anyway, these people in the woods are memorizing these books. So much so that they are almost identifying themselves. They introduce themselves. Hello, I'm Jane Austen.
Right.
Or at least one of Austen's novels. What are they doing? They're handing over. It's a tradition. And that traditio, that moment of traditio, that's what we're capturing in these books. We're saying, we start with the Greeks, there's a handing over to the Romans. Romans handing over to the Middle Ages. Middle Ages to the Renaissance. Renaissance through the Reformation to the Enlightenment. That's what we mean by tradition. It's not tevye, all right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not, sometimes tradition, and the way you would distinguish tradition and history would be to say that history is what illumines, tradition is what commands.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this is why history and tradition can sometimes find themselves in conflict with each other, because history can illumine things that you're doing on the grounds of tradition that maybe you shouldn't be doing, or maybe you don't need to do. All right, that's not the way we're using the term tradition. That's tevye, that's Fiddler on the Roof. We're using the word tradition as the handing off. And in that respect, history and tradition are not in conflict with each other. History is being used to illumine and identify what the elements of that tradition are as they have grown successively over the ages.
Okay, so there are two developments recently that bring this to mind. One is this publication of this book, which I've been diving in and out of. I wish I could pronounce his last name, Georgios Varoufakis. Anyway, it's a book called The West, The History of an Idea. And part of his argument is that the concept of the West is basically an invention of Auguste Comte from the 19th century as a way to distinguish between a rising Russia.
Yes.
And then there's this other thinker, you may have heard of, Marco Rubio, who had a pointed defense of Western civilization at the Munich Security Conference, where his stated and unstated definition seemed to basically be Christianity is Western civilization. When with those two data points in mind, like when you say this is the handing off from the Greeks to the Romans and on down the Great Chain, or the Golden Thread, I should say, when do the people, figuratively speaking, handing this off, say that what they're handing off is the West or Western thinking or Western civilization? Because certainly the Greeks weren't thinking we're the West. The Romans weren't necessarily thinking that we're the West. They were thinking we're the Romans. And so much of what you have in the book, the idea that these people are doing anything for the Western tradition or within something called the Western tradition is kind of a retroactive imposition on what they're thinking. I'm not saying that you do that. I'm just saying that this is a way of organizing the story under a concept that is coherent, that makes sense, but it doesn't necessarily describe what is going on in the people's minds when they're doing it. So when does the West become the West, that people know what you're talking about?
Well, I think there's a decent argument for you saying that the vocabulary of the West is a reasonably recent development. And yes, there is a good argument that can be made that this was part of the development of things in Russian intellectual history. That represents an argument on the part of many Russians who are suspicious of the West and who want to identify it as such, as something different from themselves. This is one thing, in fact, that I deal with in one subchapter in the Golden Thread, and that is the Eurasianists. And I express a certain degree, let's call it, of skepticism about the Eurasianist point of view. I think if there was a particular person who might be the symbol of the Eurasianist view, it probably would be Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, someone who comes fairly close to being an exercise of barbarism, just walking around on an everyday basis. But does that mean that the thing, the West, was not there and the people were conscious that they were pursuing something which was unique on its own terms? I think that is a very different kind of argument. Simply because there isn't a vocabulary to describe something doesn't mean that that thing was not, in fact, operative in people's minds, and that they were conscious of their distinction. You can see the consciousness of that distinction every time Western Europeans are going to encounter people from different places doing radically different things. And sometimes those encounters have commendable results, and sometimes they do not, because human beings are human beings and they have their weaknesses. But on the whole, the argument that says, well, this particular vocabulary about the West, that means there was nothing that could really be identified as Western civilization before that. This is a very common fallacy that you find in a number of other. It would be like saying that we had no idea that there was such a thing as civilization before the 17th century, when the French term, civilisation, when civility, this becomes more and more a matter, well, late 16th, early 17th century in English. It would be like saying that before that, Englishmen had no idea that there was such a thing as a civilization. No, that's not true. They knew what civility was. What they had to do was to find a vocabulary for it.
Or another way to think about it is like the word public opinion doesn't show up until the late 19th century, but presumably public opinion existed sometime before the term public opinion came up.
I would say so. I think that this that you can find lots of consultation on the subject of public opinion in Marcus Aurelius, and in Aristotle.
Right. But all right, so but still, there is. I mean, one of the points I'll often make about Western civilization is that it is part of the point of Western civilization is it's not one thing. It's a bunch of ideas in tension, and the idea that you should celebrate the tensions, right? But how do you, so just getting back to this idea of there was a thing that we call the West that existed prior to the vocabulary. One of the few areas I know a little bit about in terms of European history is the emergence of nationalism. And if you go and you read Fichte in some of these guys, they again, the word West isn't necessarily the thing, but they're rejecting Latin civilization.
Yes.
Right. Which is not quite the same thing as Western, but it's a pretty good approximation for some purposes. And one of the things that amazed me when I was reading a lot of that early German nationalism stuff was how much they were using language in a way that sounded like biological racism, but it was before the concepts of biological racism were really developed. But it was like, this is the only pure language. It hasn't been corrupted by the Roman this and all that kind of stuff. Does that sort of talk reveal that there were parts of things that we now call today part of Western civilization that were very late entries into Western civilization? Was German nationalism part of Western civilization, or was it a counter reaction to Western civilization?
Fichte and German nationalism are a repudiation of civilization.
Okay.
Remember, Jonah, what I said about Volume 2. Volume 2 being the unpleasant book. Unpleasant because of the story it has to tell. Jim had the benefit in Volume 1 of being able to say, "Oh, we're moving upwards." I drew the ticket for saying we're experiencing some downward movement here, and one downward movement is the reaction to the Enlightenment, to the civilization, which is Romanticism. Romanticism in the late 18th into the 19th century, because that was a repudiation. It was a repudiation, first of all, of the importance of reason. Once you repudiate the role of reason, once you question that, then you collapse a number of things together that we identify as being part of the Western tradition. Government by law. Law means nothing if it's not connected to reason. All right. law cannot function as raw irrationality. That's about power.
Mm-hmm.
But for the Romantics, power was what made the world go round, or at least that's what they thought it did. And their worship of power is what you see manifested in Romantic thinker after Romantic thinker. Frankly, whether it's Marx or whether it's Darwin or whether it's Freud, you go down the list. Fichte, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche. What so many of these have as a common denominator is the exaltation of power as a factor over that of reason. And within the rule of reason, the rule of law, monotheism, and many of the other attributes that we've talked about when we're describing this thing called civilization or the Western tradition. Romanticism is a gigantic rebellion against that. It is a repudiation of it. And we have been living with the consequences of that ever since the 19th century. In a sense, it is one of the great challenge moments, not unlike the Dark Ages, not unlike the impact of the 14th century. And the consequences of it continue to live with us because you continue to hear people who will speak only in terms of the appropriation of power and the exaltation of control. That, as I say, that's a mark of barbarism. That's a repudiation of civilization. Unfortunately, a large part of my book has to be an explanation and a chronicle of that. So yes, German nationalism, the worship of blood and soil, fine. You can take that right back to the Goths and the Vandals. We're not talking civilization at that point. And I think that people like Fichte and Herder and the other German nationalist thinkers, you know, the ones that fall between Kant and Hegel.
Mm-hmm.
These are people who have gotten tired, so to speak, and I don't mean that as a compliment or even an excuse. They're people who have gotten tired of reason. They think they found something much, much more exciting. What they have found is something much, much more toxic. They thought they were digging for gold and instead found plutonium.
Yeah, my last book, which I don't love the title, but I have regrets about it, which was Suicide of the West, which was an ode to James Burnham's book. My whole point, a huge part of my point, is that Romanticism is human nature unrestrained by reason. It is giving into your instincts. It is something that, you know, before we had clear conceptions about reason and rationalism, the early church recognized that giving into your instincts is a form of corruption, that giving into human nature is part of is entropy and moving away from the higher things. And so part of my argument is that the Romantic era never ended because really all of the modern nonsense about go with your instincts, go with your gut, the highest form of truth is your own personal authenticity. That's just recycled Romanticism from the 19th century, sometimes put in the language of self-help, sometimes put in the language of self-assertion, but that's the real enemy.
And in terms of writing history, it is the exaltation of the non-rational and sometimes the irrational.
Right.
Because what you were looking, when you try to explain historical change in terms of these mysterious forces or mysterious identities, whether they be race, whether they be class, these are things that you cannot put. You cannot put them in a box. You cannot analyze them. You cannot step outside of them and say, I'm going to give you a rational account of these things, because the people that promote them are insisting that they are proof against that.
Right.
That the very attempt to qualify, to question identity based upon those considerations is an impossibility. Well, that is a repudiation of the Enlightenment. It's a way of getting rid of the Enlightenment project. Then there's a number of people out there who are very frank and say, oh yeah, we really do want to get away from the Enlightenment. We want to put the Enlightenment into the garbage can. And I'm thinking, as we do that, watch what happened through the 20th century, because the people who made hell out of the 20th century were all the people who were the heirs of the Romantics.
All right, so I got to get into some questions about the Protestant Reformation, but we're on this Enlightenment thing, so let me get to that. I've really wrestled with. I think you might recall I am not a huge fan of post-liberalism and that whole project, and And whenever I get into fights with post-liberals, I say, well, you do realize that Karl Marx in many ways was the first post-liberal. And at least he was honest about what he was doing, right? But partly because I'm working on this new book, it is not entirely clear to me anymore. I used to think, okay, Enlightenment-based liberalism is that, liberalism basically comes from the Enlightenment, and obviously liberalism gets a lot from the Enlightenment. But, I read Quentin Skinner and some of these other, and there is, and de Tocqueville, Yuval Levin pointed this out to me, gives like 1,000-year history of liberalism without making reference to the Enlightenment.
Mhm.
So, can you just sort of disentangle for me? I think once you get past 1750, trying to disentangle liberalism from Enlightenment gets very, very difficult and thorny. But prior to that, it feels like there is, some of the English traditions, what was it there? The founding fathers used to talk about their ancient British liberties. That was an appeal to some extent to a liberalism that came before the Enlightenment. So like, which is the chicken and which is the egg? What is the relationship between the two? Is the Western tradition more than sort of liberalism and the Enlightenment? And if so, how so?
Well, politically speaking, the Western tradition is certainly wrapped around the Enlightenment. And my response to individuals who are convinced that what is going on in the American environment is based upon something other than those kind of universals. My response is simply to say, all right, tell me, what ancient British liberties did we put into the Constitution?
Mm-hmm.
Where are the footnotes? And the answer is, they aren't there. Where are the ancient British liberties in the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence? Not there. Because, in fact, the ancient British liberties really didn't have a whole lot of application to the people who were in the American colonies. Instead, the people who were in the American colonies looked a whole lot more like John Locke. People in the 17th and into the 18th centuries who read Locke in England, all right, so they're reading the two treatises on government, they're reading the essay on toleration, the letter on toleration. What they think they're reading is a thought experiment. Because no one is going to read Locke and then the next morning decide, well, let's get rid of the monarchy. Let's all turn it. It's so much of a thought experiment that if you want to see Locke with flesh on the bones, you have to go to a novel in England, all right? And that's Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is really Locke and the two treatises, and this is what it would look like. That was England. No one woke up the next day after reading the two treatises and said, okay, well, that's the monarchy is obviously over. We're going to do something entirely different. No, it was a thought experiment. In the American colonies, it's different. The American colonies, well, not to put too fine a point on it, the American colonies are the place where the British send all their unwanteds. The people who are sent to the colonies are Puritans and Quakers and Catholics and debtors and convicts, everybody whom the Brit leaders wanted to flush out of their system. And so it was like, all right, get on the boat, have a nice 3,000-mile ocean trip, and let's not hear from you again. That's what they did. So all of these people organized themselves because they had no alternative. They had to set up their own little legislatures. They had to create their own militias. They had to write their own statutes, none of which technically had any legal standing in the British Empire, but they had to do it. They had no choice. What were they doing? Suddenly, Locke stopped being a thought experiment. And the American colonies were an embodiment of what Locke described. They could read John Locke and say, oh, this is us. This is how we were founded. This is how we've set up our governments. And when in the 1760s, the imperial planners in London decided that, no, we really would like to extend traditional British ways of doing things to the colonies, like directly taxing them. The response of the colonies was, oh, no, we've never done it that way. And in fact, we're not going to let you do it that way to us. We're going to set up our own shop. And so they do. This is one reason why you have influential legal thinkers in the early republic, like Nathaniel Chipman, who in a sense want to apply Locke directly. They want to get rid of English common law, because and Jefferson is another example of this too. These are people who say, why do we want to import English common law when so much of it is is predicated on the notion of royal sovereignty? I mean, why? Jefferson was particularly upset that so many American lawyers had read Blackstone, because his feeling was Blackstone's going to point you in exactly the wrong direction. Blackstone's commentaries all assume that sovereignty arises from the royal supremacy. And Jefferson's argument was that's not what we're doing in this republic. And there were a number of other people who agreed that way. Now, in the long run, we have to take over certain elements of English common law. And the reason we do it is raw necessity. You just can't invent an entire new structure of statute law overnight. Doesn't happen. People are busy suing each other, and they're not going to stop doing that, waiting for a statute to catch up with them. But it does mean that even the elements of common law that are taken over from British precedent are all Americanized. You read the legal treatises, like, right, here's an example, Henry St. George Tucker. This is an Americanization of English common law. Not because we loved English common law, but because we couldn't invent our own fast enough. So we had to borrow something at least we had some comprehension of and could read in something other than translation. But it's a borrowing, and it's not more than that. Otherwise, we're heading in our own directions. And by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, you're already starting to see serious deviations between what had been British precedent and what Americans are developing. This is because the whole foundation of American identity and American law is heading in a unique direction. We are not just clones of Britain. We arise out of very different circumstances. And those circumstances show to us that, in fact, what we were doing is exactly what Locke was describing you would do if you found yourself in the state of nature. Colonists back in 1630, they looked around in what they were calling Boston Harbor, and that, for all the world, looked for them like the state of nature, as in fact it was.
Okay, can I just push back for the sake of the argument on one narrow aspect of this and just see what you think? When you say show me the footnotes, so one point I made is that there are cultural traditions that come from the English that ripen over time to the point when they come to America, they cease to be cultural traditions, but we've cleared the dross away and we find the core principle in them and then we codify them. And so, for example, the one I often use is, the concept of a man's home as his castle goes back to Teutonic tribes, and it gets incorporated into British common law, gets incorporated into Blackstone. And by the time it gets to the United States, in part because of the experience of the revolutionary generation with the British, it ends up becoming codified, reified, abstracted into the Fourth Amendment. You can do something similar with, the wars of religion. Teach people, that not to settle issues of conscience at the tip of a sword. You start to get this sort of cultural accommodation of the right to be wrong to a certain extent. You get Locke talking about toleration for Protestant sects, but not the Catholics. and then by the time you get to America, the core principle becomes legible enough and clear enough and rational enough that Jefferson, in his notes on toleration or whatever at Virginia, is saying that pagans, heathens, Hindus, of course Catholics, they all have these rights, right? And so, I'm a Hayekian guy. I think there's a lot of things that are best practices are often discovered through, and Burke too, right? Through trial and error, and they start as sort of just best practices. Hey, this is the shortest path between these two buildings. Let's put a walkway here, because that's the way the students are already walking, and so the ideas sometimes are lagging indicators of the practices, and that's how I see some of the American founding generation is these intellectuals were very close students of the Republic of Venice, of all of these things, said, here are some core principles that we can glean from historical experience. Let's write them down and think them through in a serious way. And the American Constitutional Convention, it was borrowing the structure, that we get from Polybius and from, Magna Carta all the way through the English Revolution of a monarchical figure checked by a judiciary and a legislative. That grew up organically first and then became the idea rather than the other way around. Is that completely wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Walk me through it.
You want to talk about branches of government? You have to talk about Montesquieu.
Okay.
Right. You don't have branches of government.
Right.
In the British system. You have a monarchy which claims sovereignty arises from the king. You have that challenged by Parliament. But Parliament itself is having a great deal of difficulty over the ages trying to find a rationalization for how it's going to deal with the king. What it has to do in the 1640s is it's going to have a civil war, and it's going to have to cut off the head of the king. And as Cromwell said, cut off his head with the crown on it. And what do they attempt to invent then? They've got to start all over, and they realize they have to start all over. This is what you get in the experiment of the English Republic. And they can't make it work for a variety of reasons that are peculiar to the situation of the 1650s. It won't work. And what you get, the monarchy comes back. We didn't reestablish a monarchy in this country. When we sat down to call the Constitutional Convention into order, James Madison shows up with having written a very extensive series of notes on what previous political regimes had looked like. And he composes that not so that he can say, here's a wonderful checklist of things from the past, and especially from our English experience, that we should take over into this new constitutional order. No, he makes a list of things we should avoid. Because we're going to do something very different. We're doing something new. That's why the slogan is there. Novus Ordo Seclorum. This is a new order in the ages. Because the Americans are reaching for principles that are not merely British, that are not merely English. If they were, we would not have the kind of government that we have today. We have a system of government based on the Constitution of 1787, which is very different from the British system, even at its most democratic, even today. The Prime Minister of Great Britain is simply the head of a particular political party. No one votes for the Prime Minister.
Right.
There's not even an electoral college in the British system. Where did Americans get that idea from? They certainly weren't getting it from British example. What they were getting it from was two sources. One, experience. Secondly, their experience as the colonies. And secondly, from the literature of the Enlightenment, which is to say, the Western tradition in its Enlightenment form. Well, Jonah, one more thing.
Yeah.
Here's one particularly important lock that gets put on this. And that is 80 some years after the Declaration and after the Constitutional Convention, a very tall man in a black suit gets up on a platform at Gettysburg and tells us what our history has been. And it is a history in which we come into being dedicated to a proposition that all men are created equal. And for Lincoln, for that tall man, this is a non-negotiable. This is the thing which he has formed his whole political life around. And he has said over and over again, this is the fundamental set of axioms. These are the sheet anchors of American republicanism. We are based on a proposition. Oh my goodness, if Joseph de Maistre had been in that audience at the dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery, he would have been jumping up and down, flailing his arms and saying, no. Because he thought, de Maistre makes fun of the idea. How can you make a constitution out of tracts of ink on paper?
Right.
And Lincoln's point is, that happens to be exactly what the Americans did. And they built this nation around this proposition. You are loyal to that proposition, that is going to pay certain dividends. And that proposition is something you can be loyal to. It's something you can be dedicated to. It is something that will give you a new birth of freedom. So for him, yes, we are based on a proposition straight out of the Enlightenment. He makes no reference to British law, British tradition, because look, most of the people that were being buried in that cemetery, they didn't come from Britain.
Right.
And Lincoln's very clear about this. Lincoln says, this is in July of 1850. I'm sorry to belabor Lincoln here, but you will understand that I tend to reach pretty quickly.
Yeah.
For
For listeners who don't know, you've written, by my rough count,
Yeah,
4,000 books on the Civil War. So,
but in 1858, this is what Lincoln says, that half the people in this country have come from someplace else, or else they're the offspring of people who come from someplace else. They didn't have great-grandpa in the snows at Valley Forge with George Washington. All right, so they're from Scandinavia, they're from France, etc. But he says, when they look through that old Declaration of Independence and they read those words, that all men are created equal, are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, Lincoln said, then they feel that they are flesh of the flesh and blood of the blood of those old men that wrote the Declaration. And so they are. That is the electric cord that runs through the hearts of every lover of liberty around the world. So Lincoln is not appealing to something that is a particular inheritance of British or English-speaking culture. He believes he has found a key to something that appeals deeply to human nature itself. And that was the argument of the Enlightenment politics all the way through its overthrow of hierarchical authority.
So maybe I can square the circle about where I'm coming from in this regard. I don't disagree with you about the role or the importance of the principles. I just don't think the principles come ex nihilo, from nothing and emerge. They are epiphenomenal of a tradition, of a history, this sort of process of refinement that you get until they are clear, and then there's a sort of a upward ratchet effect to say, okay, we figured out this is a good way to organize society. Let's write this down and let's lock this in. And I think you can find a little bit of analogy just to broaden the conversation out in terms of Christianity, that through some of the work that you've done, but also Tom Holland and some others, like I've really come around on this idea. Walter Russell Mead has written a wonderful essay about this, about the Abrahamic faiths. There are an enormous number of people who have signs in front of their houses saying, in this house we believe in science and human rights and blah, blah, blah. And they have no idea the degree to which almost all of their ethical and moral constructs are derived essentially from first of all, primarily from the Abrahamic faith, but more specifically and more directly from Christianity. Notions of conscience, notions of individual dignity and of rights. Those ideas predate anything that we call the Enlightenment, anything that we call liberalism. But those ideas are what lead, maybe not inexorably, because the barbarians sometimes win a few battles, but those ideas are the things that allowed to, if properly nurtured, lead to the Enlightenment and lead to liberalism. And so I guess first of all, you can respond to that any way you like, but the question I guess I have is, how much of Western civilization as we understand it today is powerfully bound up with the Reformation? I mean, is the Reformation the Pandora's box that unleashes both liberalism and the Enlightenment? Do you get the Enlightenment without it?
Well, this is a question which has been seriously debated and for a long time. And I'm leery of suggesting, let's say, a percentage. This percentage of the Enlightenment is owed to the Protestant Reformation. There were moments when the Protestant Reformation could, in fact, take some fairly lethal forms. So it was not necessarily something which is going to give us as a gift, an automatic gift, the Enlightenment. But if you take Christianity as a whole, if you take the Protestant Reformation and take alongside it the Counter Reformation, as it sometimes is called, my Catholic friends do not like for me to call it the Counter Reformation, and but I do it because I'm on the other side of that divide. So I have a little bit of my own. I have to recognize. What you get are certain principles that emerge from that, which are constants, going all the way back to Moses, going all the way back to the experience of ancient Israel. And these are constants. Why are they they're constants because they speak directly to human nature itself. And these constants are part of this Western tradition. They're not, one does not get a Protestant Reformation that is purely German. All right, it begins in the German lands. But the Reformation quickly becomes a very international affair. And you find it in the Scandinavian lands, you find it in England, you find it in France, you find it in so many different places. Why? Because fundamentally, it attaches itself to some very basic notions that are components of this ongoing tradition, this handing over of civilization. So it acts not as a reaction to civilization, much less in opposition to it, but it acts as yet another subchapter within it, the exploration of it. When you say a tradition, maybe I need a.
You know, these guys and Jonah Goldberg specifically, they somehow or another either lightly cover or skip over altogether that the Enlightenment came about because of religious factionalism. So, yeah, a lot of the principles of the Enlightenment came from Christianity, but so what? The Enlightenment would not have happened had there not been so much warring going on after the Protestant Reformation. And I mean, where else were they going to get their principles from? It was almost like a straight line evolution. It's no big whoop that, I mean, where else were the traditions going to come from? Europe was Christian. I don't understand why they make so much of it.
I've said this a little earlier. Tradition is not like wills and estates. When you have, all right, here I'm willing to my grandchildren my old cedar chest. All right, they're going to get the cedar chest, period. And it's not going to be taken apart, and they're not going to fight over it. It's the cedar chest. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about tradition. We're talking about something that is in ferment, constant ferment, because its ideas are in ferment, because its ideas contain so many complexities and so many opportunities. This is why I spoke of argument for the sake of heaven. And this is, it's a particularly Jewish way of phrasing that, but I think it captures something very important, that we do continue to argue, and we regard argument as legitimate. Protestant Reformation, Catholic Counter-Reformation, these are arguments that we are having with each other within this Western tradition. So the tradition is not a single file march. Rather, it is 4 and 6 and 8 across that are moving. They are moving in a direction, but at the same time, they're also doing it by their own beat and by their own step. And part of the thing which it seems to me is a vital aspect of this Western tradition is that argument that takes place within the meaning of the tradition itself.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's fighting words to call you a Hegelian, but there's a very loose way in which I think sort of the Hegel thesis, antithesis stuff is useful. I mean,
but that's argument, Jonah. The Hegelian dialectic is not an argument.
Right, I get it, but I just think metaphorically, this idea that part of the Western tradition But my point is, as a conservative, one of the things that makes me a Burkean conservative is that is a recognition that not all good things go in unison. That there are, as Burke would say, every good principle hits, it's to a point, right? And then it starts to run into some diminishing returns. You don't believe in absolute freedom, but you believe in freedom. You don't believe in absolute order, but you believe in order. And sometimes freedom and order, liberty and virtue, these things can be in tension. And the essence of wisdom is to figure out how to reconcile these things in the maximally beneficial way that doesn't sacrifice too much of one or too much of the other. And I think that, like, when you're talking about romanticism, I think one of the defining psychological features of romanticism is the idea, it's a childlike thing that says you can have your cake and eat it too. It says that you don't have to make any choices. As Tom Sowell would say, to govern is to choose. And the part of the Western tradition is that it's this tension. And so I would argue that there were a lot of barbarians on the Protestant side, on the early part of the Reformation. Most of the witch burning was done, by secular Protestant leaders rather than, the Catholic Church put out a lot of witch burnings and that kind of thing because they had an institutional understanding about reason and facts and evidence, and they would go in and investigate things. And there was a certain kind of populism that came on the Protestant side. These things were in tension and they work themselves out over time. And then you get this that's the only thing I meant about the Hegelian part, is you get a new synthesis where you incorporate these new ideas and new ways of living into the Western tradition. And then you start the process of trying to figure out how to codify them. Am I wrong again? Okay. How am I wrong this time?
Burke is a romantic.
I'm not. I've heard this argument. I think
it's not an argument. It's a fact. Burke is a romantic, and the proof of it is in his treatise on the Sublime. I know that's not about the politics, but if you want to understand Burkean politics, go back to that treatise on the Sublime, very early in Burke's career. But there you have it all laid out. It is a fundamental subversion of the principles of reason. And a lot of the fundamental subversion of the principles of reason is what gets built into so much of his later politics. Because what is he? All those Frenchmen whose swords were supposed to fly out of their scabbards to defend Marie Antoinette. I mean, my question is, why? Why was Marie Antoinette worthy of that kind of response, or at least Burke thought there ought to be that kind of response? Well, Burke.
By the way, and I've said it a few times last week, I'm actually going back and rereading some stuff and reading some new stuff, the capital L liberalism stuff, and even going back to some conservative stuff. To be honest, I actually don't consider Burke that far right. He's considered the father of modern conservatism, but I would actually, to a large extent, call myself Burkean. If it's possible to have a Burkean liberal. So we'll see how it goes. But I'm actually glad that a lot of people seem pretty engaged with this particular video.
Rationalization for it is, well, we should be noble, we should be chivalrous, and she was the queen. I'm sorry, that does not make someone right that you want to defend them. No, that's the romantic. And the Hegelian notion of synthesis is not about disagreement and then finding some way of talking about things. No, the Hegelian synthesis is a non-rational development. What takes place with Hegelian synthesis is not debate and discussion. It is these ineffable essences that move in ways that cannot be predicted. And that is why Hegel thinks that this is the fundamental understanding, the fundamental underlayment, so to speak, of human history. The whole movement of human history is towards identities that are not based upon reason, the summit of which is going to be the glorification of the state. And that, I'm sorry, that's not the Enlightenment. That certainly is not what is meant by debate for the sake of for the argument for the sake of heaven is like the argument among all the rabbis. It is like the argument that is encoded by the Talmud. It is debate which is never going to get a final answer until some apocalyptic moment out beyond human history. And we're going to live with the disagreements of Rabbi so-and-so with Rabbi so-and-so. We're going to live with the disagreements of John Calvin and Martin Luther. We're going to live with them because living with them is a far better alternative than massacre in their name. And we're going to do it because we also understand that while we're trying to govern our lives by the principle of reason, like Pascal, who is not a romantic, despite all the talk about the heart has its reasons, etc., Pascal is an eminently reasonable person because he understands that reason has its limits. Reason is not, the great discovery of reason is what reason cannot discover. And Pascal is warning us. If you try to have a religion without reason, what you'll get is a nightmare. If you try to have reason without religion, you'll get a different kind of nightmare, but it's still a nightmare. What you have with reason is to recognize there's going to be a number of things you're never going to resolve because the human imagination and the human intellect is never going to completely resolve them. How do you do it? You can either embrace them in tension, that's a legitimate kind of work, or you can recognize that you establish some kind of peace between them, which is, so to speak, the Washingtonian solution in the letter to the Truro Synagogue. What does this new government require of you? Washington says, and all right, yes, maybe it wasn't Washington, maybe it was Hamilton that wrote it. Okay. What the letter says, this government asks of you only that you comport yourselves as good citizens. This government gives to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance. And in saying that, all right, then we have captured an Enlightenment way of doing things. There's no synthesis at work there. There's no moment that says, well, everyone is going to come together and we're going to move on to this new non-rational conclusion. That's not what that is about. And that is not what the Enlightenment is about. That's a romantic understanding of how history functions.
Yeah, I did not mean to be drag in Hegel in a literal sense so much as in a figurative sense in terms of, and I think we do have a fundamental disagreement on some of this insofar as I see the advance of Western civilization a little bit like, trying to find the right metaphor here, climbing a mountain. And it's a sheer rock face in many parts. And the only way to make sure you can fall backwards, but the only way you make sure you don't fall too far backwards is by hammering in some pitons that will stop how far back you fall. And I think a lot of the principles that you and I think are part of the essence of the best version of Western civilization are those pitons, right? That's why, like, I'm sure you know this, but when you actually read the Magna Carta or there are various versions of it, it's a grubby kind of weird trade deal, right? It is not some lofty thing, but the mere fact of writing it,
philosophy.
Yeah, it's like writing it down was one of those pitons, right? Just this idea that there's a public compact, an agreement agreed upon in public that is going to be written down that people can refer to was a huge advance for, civilization. And similarly, the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, these things are pitons as far as I'm concerned. And the problem with the metaphor is that at the end of the day, they're not pitons because if people reject them, they just vanish, right? It's like the only thing that keeps the Constitution going is our reverence for it. And they are in our institutional and personal commitments to it. And that does worry me, but I think that that I'm not a Alan Dershowitz fan, but his claim that rights come from wrongs, that bad things happen and people respond to them and come up with alternatives. I reject a lot of it, but I don't reject all of it insofar as there was a lot in Jesus, in the Bible, and in the Jewish tradition that said the wars of religion are not what they would want, not what Jesus would want. They happened anyway. And sometimes you have to show people, not tell people, and they have to rediscover these lessons.
Mm-hmm.
And that the facts on the ground part, I think, if you're just ideas first in everything, you give short shrift to the importance of the showing rather than the telling. That's sort of just my approach to it. I do want to, and you are absolutely free to respond to any of that. I do need to ask you, now that you have covered, what is it, 5,000 years, 4,000 years? What is the starting date on this?
Really long time. Battle of Marathon.
Okay. Where do you come down on the great man theory of history?
I don't talk about the great man theory in these books, if only because I'm uncertain about the intersection between personal greatness and situations.
Mm-hmm.
Let me default to Lincoln again.
I saw it coming a mile away.
All right. So suppose for a moment Lincoln gets elected to the United States Senate in 1858, that he vanquishes Stephen A. Douglas when the Illinois legislature comes together to elect a senator. All right. Lincoln goes to Washington, 1858. He's a member of the U.S. Senate. Then what happens 3 years later?
Mm-hmm.
What do we get? Who becomes the president? Who is going to navigate through the secession crisis? Well, we'd like to say, well, we need somebody like Lincoln then, because the assumption is he's going to stay in the United States Senate because he wanted to. That's what he really wanted, that seat in the United States Senate.
And he would have been a great senator.
Well, maybe.
Yeah.
He was elected to the House of Representatives. Was he a great member of Congress
Fair, yeah.
from 1847 to 49? And the answer is, well, maybe. It wasn't.
Fair.
It was sufficiently undistinguished that there was no groundswell for reelecting him to Congress in 1849. All right. Well, if Lincoln had not been available, what would we have gotten then as president? Well, look at some of the preceding presidents, really memorable characters like Miller or Fillmore.
Mm-hmm.
Would we have gotten another one like that? And would we have ever heard of Abraham Lincoln afterwards? Or at least would we have heard of him more than, let's say, William Seward or Thomas Hart Benton? Sometimes the individual and the situation have to meet. And that what we want to talk about as a great man is someone who has, yes, great capacities, but there are the niceties of the moment and the contingency of historical events, which also provide openings that might not otherwise have been there. I mean, suppose those 3 bullet holes in Washington's uniform coat at the Battle of the Monongahela had found some other home than just the fabric.
Mm-hmm.
What would have happened in 1775, 76, and beyond that? There is an element of contingency in human history, behind which stands a great mystery in Augustinian terms of how human events unfold, but which we are not privy to, and therefore we can't write about. We just can't. We have to look at human history in what appears, from our experience, to be a succession of contingencies.
Uh-huh.
So yes, there have been some great individuals, but a lot of the greatness that we celebrate is a result of being in the right place at the right time.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes it hasn't always happened.
Uh-huh.
There was a great moment, just to give you a non-Lincolnian example, so that I'm not just being a Johnny One Note. In Germany, after 1918, Can we think of a single leader between 1918 and 1933 who stands out as an apostle of democracy for taking what had been the Bismarckian imperial monarchy and converting it into a democracy? Is there a single individual who stands out? Well, maybe kind of Gustav Stresemann, maybe. But then cast yourself to post 1945. Then you have the character of Konrad Adenauer. Well, I think today people, I'm surprised the degree to which Adenauer has faded from a lot of imaginations. I think he was a great statesman. And he was a statesman of tremendous religious conviction, of principle, of honesty with his own people. If Adenauer had been in the position that he did occupy post-1945, if he had been in a position like that in, let's say, 1921, would there ever have been an Adolf Hitler? Perhaps not. Perhaps not. So sometimes the moment and the individual are dependent on each other that way. So I'm dicey enough, and I have a sense of the contingency of events, large scale enough, that I don't want to put too large of a crown on the head of the great man, quote unquote. Because I recognize that there's sometimes there's situations that cry out for that, and the cry is not heard.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. Insofar as the kind of vulgar Marxist notion that leaders don't matter has to be wrong. Right? The idea that all events would have unfolded thusly no matter what is crazy.
That's your Hegelian inexorability. And it is the left Hegelianism that Marx sucks up through Feuerbach, and which we've been dealing with in Marxist ideology ever since. The idea that not only leaders don't matter, culture does not matter. Culture, these are all superstructural elements, because fundamentally what Marx believed was the beating heart of human history and human experience was power.
Right.
But that's pauperism.
And I would argue I'm with Paul Johnson and a few others on this. I think it's pretty clear that Marx was a romantic.
He is.
Yeah, he's just a romantic figure who uses the language of science as a disguise.
We miss the boat entirely if we do not understand Marx as preeminently a romantic figure.
And the best sort of short illustration of that, when I said before that part of romanticism is the childlike desire to have your way in every regard, his nirvana at the end of history, when the state withers away, is a place where he will be able to write poetry in the morning and hunt in the afternoon and fish in the evening, where he gets to do everything he wants and self-actualize without any restraint. And that's childish, right?
And notice that is the environment that he describes in the vaguest terms.
For sure. Yeah.
Because he has no real concept of what that is going to look like. Whether you define things in terms of blood and soil, the way, for instance, that Herder would define the movement of history, or whether you define it in terms of class, which is how Marx defines it, it is fundamentally a non-rational and a romantic way of understanding human history.
Okay, I could do this all day, so when you tell me you have to leave, I will stop. But
I've lost track. We've been having more fun than is legal.
Let's get back to the liberalism enlightenment stuff a little bit. So I recently read what I found a very useful book, Helena Rosenblatt's The Lost History of Liberalism, where she looks at the history of the word rather than the history of the idea. And it gives you another interesting way of looking at things. And one of the things that I had a newfound appreciation for the significance of Napoleon III. But one of the things that is pretty interesting in it, and some of the other reading I've been doing related to it, is this idea that democracy and liberalism are tied together, are complementary terms, that concepts that go together, is a fairly recent thing. And that's why I bring up Napoleon III, because he was being denounced by Daniel Webster and other people as a guy ruining the concept, ruining the good name of democracy because of his illiberal democracy. And that's where it was around that time that illiberal democracy and Caesarism enters the lexicon. Do you think that it was inevitable to some extent that democracy and liberalism would end up being joined at the hip? Do you think the concepts are such that they have to team up, or do you think that democracy can still be the friend of illiberalism?
Well, you can pervert just about anything. And Madison, of course, had that marvelous comment on the Federalist Papers that if every member of the Athenian assembly had been a Socrates, the assembly would still have been a mob.
Right.
So simply because you are able to confine participation in political society to the citizen, to the liber, does not necessarily mean you're always going to get something that is desirable. Human nature is made of this crooked timber, and human nature has a capacity to defeat even the best constructed ideas. We constructed a constitution, and we were going on for about 70 plus years, which is not a whole lot of time, and already people were trying to destroy it. All right, so human nature is what it is. But if we assume that liberalism and democracy, reified as ideas, have a certain overlap, well, yes, they do, because within liberalism, there is the fundamental conviction about an equality that inheres in human beings. All right, if there is an equality that inheres in human beings, and however it manifests itself, politically or otherwise, if there is that equality, then each person who is a member of a given liberal society ought to have an equal say in what is going on. And that equal say, that consent of the governed that Jefferson talked about, is something that is a non-negotiable in thinking about a democracy. Now, can a democracy turn into a lynch mob? Yes, very easily. We've seen many examples of it. That is not, though, a description of the inevitability of liberalism or democracy. It's a description that warns every liberal democracy of what lurks within human nature itself, so that we are on guard against our own weaknesses. Ideas are not perfect armor against the human temptation to power. One of the great accomplishments of the American founders was to understand that liberty and power are two very different quantities, but no functioning society can ever entirely get rid of one or the other if they're going to talk about themselves in any way humane. If you want to emphasize, as the founders did, the liberty aspect, well, some people would like to get rid of power completely. But if you do, what you get is the Articles of Confederation. And what you get is weakness, and then weakness simply invites tyranny. You create anarchy, and you have then the soldier on the white horse who's going to cure it all. You have to have some element of power. Someone has to keep the traffic lights on.
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to be an element of power. But what you want to do is you want to define it very carefully. You want to confine its role and its aspect, because you recognize, again, this is like a toxic element. It is like one of those elements that in very small quantities easily poisons. So that is how powerful. You can't get rid of power entirely, or else what you'll get is chaos. But if you want to prize liberty, then you have to guard and hedge in power very, very carefully. If I take a moment to speak to modern politics at all, it seems to me that is a lesson that we have forgotten a great deal about. It is a lesson, I think, of the Enlightenment. I think it's also a lesson about human nature, but I think it's a lesson of the Enlightenment. But it's a lesson which the Romantics, and which the 19th century and in the 20th century deliberately threw to the winds, because they believed that power could overcome human nature. And if you exercised enough power and put it into the hands of people who would know what to do with it, they would create these fundamental utopias. And utopia grows out of power. Well, if you want utopia, fine, but I'm not sure I want to live next door to you.
Since you brought up the Confederate Papers, the Articles of Confederation, I just gotta. I'm sorry. It leads me to a question I've wanted to ask you for a while, but not about the Articles of Confederation, but about the Confederacy. But I got hung up on the word Confederation.
So did they.
There is, as you know, orders of magnitude better than I do. There's a school of thought that says, there's a joke on the internet that goes something like this. It's like, lowbrow person says the Civil War was about slavery. The middlebrow intellectual says, actually, it was very, very, very complicated. And there are all these different factors. And then the actual scholar says, it was about slavery. But there are people who will argue that the Southerners had a different political science, a different conception of how government should work, and it really wasn't just about slavery. But then if you go look at the kind of state constitutions they wanted to create and the arguments they were having about it, it seems like it was just they wanted to copy what the North did or what the founders did, but just keep slavery around.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something more is there something more to those claims than I'm seeing? Is there some sort of Philip K. Dick alternative history of the South that is about a broader, bigger question of political science than just wanting to keep slavery?
Yes and no. All right. Which is a handy answer for almost any problem.
Sure.
Yes, there is more at stake than simply saying we're trying to do this to defend slavery, because they invent this whole fairy tale structure of understanding societies, all with a view, though, to justifying slavery. They would never have invented the fairy tale if it was not for the defense of slavery. But you create, for instance, a John Calhoun. All right, John Calhoun, I know you're not going to like this, but I'm going to say it anyway. John Calhoun is the American Burke.
Mm-hmm. I don't like it, but go on.
you will understand the line of thinking that leads me to say that. All right. If not the American Burke, then certainly I would say he's the American Hegel. All
Fair.
right.
Okay. I can throw Hegel under the bus all day long.
All right, you're there. You got to first base. Now, why does the American Civil War take place? Now, this is a question I ask him the very opening of my Civil War course. And I say, all right, let's get Aristotelian. All right. When we talk about cause, we understand that there is formal cause, there's final cause, you go through the four notions of causality.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, all right, understand that what causes the Civil War? Most immediate cause, secession. That's why there was war. I mean, people tried to secede from the Union. All right, so that's one cause. Another cause is sectionalism. Because if slavery had been legal, for instance, in Minnesota, in Maine, in Florida, and Louisiana, there would never have been a Civil War. The thing that made the Civil War possible was that the slave states were all contiguous to each other. And because they were contiguous, they looked like they could form a nation state and get away with it.
Mm-hmm.
So if slavery had been that disparate, then you wouldn't have had a conflict, because no one would in their right mind would have attempted the kind of thing that was attempted in 1861. So, all right, sectionalism is a rule. Federalism itself. Federalism is what gives people the notion that, all right, since the federal union is made up of component parts, all you have to do is break some of the component parts away. All right, that's not really the message of federalism, but it was an interpretation that Southerners were able to create as a justification. So, all right, when you see all those things in sequence, then you begin to get a big picture about this thing called the causes of the Civil War. That does not, however, subtract the fact that at the end of the day, if you take slavery out of any of those algorithms, there's no slavery, there's no Civil War. Slavery is what makes the Civil War. The testimony to it comes from the Southern ordinances of secession, because they tell you over and over and over again, we're doing this to protect slavery. This is what Alex Stevens says. This is what the literature of defending Southern secession says it's all about defending slavery. That means that the justifications that are offered, that what the South represents is this romantic culture that is growing out of the soil and the blood and blah 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 like that. It's all done for the justification of slavery. If you had subtracted slavery from the equation in 1787, if the convention had done what some members of the convention wanted to do, like George Mason, all right, Gouverneur Morris, these are people who, let's condemn this thing called slavery. If we had done that, none of these other things would have been called for. All these other matters become questions of justification and of gussying up human chattel bondage. And there are some, I will probably get some nasty emails about this. But don't worry, I have a whole file of them. People who want to set me straight and say, oh, no, that wasn't what the Confederacy was about. And I say, oh, yes, it was. And in fact, the Confederacy was about slavery right up until about the last week before it winked off. Because it was right up to that point, people were still buying and selling slaves. And at that point, you wonder, what were they thinking about? Oh, they were thinking about slavery, because that's how it began.
I mean, I can muster a certain amount of empathetic imagination to say that there are people who thought it was about a way of life, and we're not cognizant of the fact that that way of life depended on slavery. But that's lipstick on a pig to a certain extent. But
I'll be the first to admit, what we're talking about are the people who are in the leadership positions.
Right.
These are the ones who are inventing the excuses that they're using to get the people to go along with this. If you interview individual people here, there, and everywhere, even if you interview individual soldiers in the Confederate Army, you're liable to get quite a broad set of responses as to why they are while they're participating in this war. I remember reading this one comment from a Tennessean who said, well, if it came down to the United States versus another country, I fight for the United States. If it's between two parts of the United States, I go with my part of the United States. If it's between my state and other states, I go with my state. If it's between my side of the street and the other side of the street, I go with my side of the street. All right. Yeah. Their human motivation is rarely predictable, except when you get to the politicians. The politicians and the journalists, then it becomes a whole lot more predictable. But even recognizing that, fundamentally, the Confederacy is a movement it is based on a lie, and it is based on an obscenity, and its product was obscenity. And it cost us a tremendous price in human life to erase that we could have saved ourselves from in 1787, but which, for a variety of reasons, we did not move to do so. And we paid that penalty. And it was a penalty we all paid. That's Lincoln's message in the second inaugural.
All right. I have to stop abusing your time. I know listeners will say, why did you stop? But I figure since we're the 250th year anniversary, I'm kind of obsessed with the certain line of questioning that I have. I also feel like someone made a wish on a monkey paw, and we had Donald Trump be president on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, but we won't get into all of that. So we at the Dispatch, we have a weekly series of essays near weekly on the different aspects of the 250th anniversary. And I did the kickoff one, making what I think is an incredibly humble statement that is nonetheless very controversial in certain quarters, which is that the American Revolution was a really big deal. And that it was part of, you get the Hobsbawm long 19th century argument, right? And one of the things that kind of breaks my heart is I always loved Irving Kristol's essay, The American Revolution as a Successful Revolution. And then I reread it I hadn't read it in a long time, and I reread it when I was writing that. And I completely had forgotten that he had quoted Hannah Arendt saying that the American Revolution had virtually no impact on Europe, was not referred to or thought of as an important thing. You know, it was like utterly dismissive. And so the question I have is, first of all, I know you think that's wrong because that is just objectively wrong.
Right.
And you're free to expand on that as you see fit. But what is it about the quote unquote revolutionary tradition that everyone wants to start it with the French Revolution? Why is the French Revolution, which was a failed revolution, which led to the terror and to Napoleon and autocracy, why is that looked on so reverentially by not just radicals, but by historians? I mean, like my friends at the Rest of History podcast, is a great podcast. I just couldn't believe how they were talking about how the French Revolution was vastly more influential than the American Revolution, and that there was no contest. And I was like, well, first of all, America exists, and it's the most consequential nation of the last X number of centuries. And but for America, the world looks very different. And so by virtue of that alone, the American Revolution is more significant. But also the ideas of the French Revolution, yeah, they inspired the Bolsheviks and they inspired a lot of revolutionary movements. Is it just a pure ideological taste test that they like the flavor of that kind of revolutionary stuff? Why is the American Revolution cast out into the old 18th century and not part of the long 19th century and the revolutionary tradition that gets such fawning treatment by most historians?
Because the American Revolution is a revolution that's entered into in classical terms. In other words, reluctantly.
Mm-hmm.
The American Revolution is entered into by people who understand that you are throwing the dice in a revolutionary moment.
I guess I'll let him finish. However, the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution is the French Revolution was populist. It was people wanting to throw out the aristocrats. The American Revolution was a revolution of elites. Okay, it was elites who were pissed off because they weren't being treated like proper English gentlemen / elites. Okay, George Washington, I've heard it said that George Washington was possibly the largest private landowner in the world, or one of them. Thomas Jefferson, even though he constantly had, he lived above his means, but all the founders and framers, for the most part, were elites of one type or another. So that's like the main difference. George Washington was not looking to overthrow an aristocracy. They were looking to establish an aristocracy or something akin to it.
And bad things can happen as a result. They had in front of them a comparatively recent example in what happens to the English Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
What do you get? You get Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. You get the rule of the Major General.
Excuse me. Well, Natasha, you all can always come up to the chat. I don't think I posted the link, but I mean, you all are always welcome to come up and ask questions. I may or may not know the answers, and really, this particular, I've just been probably over the last year, but more so, I would say, since Christmas, have really been, thinking and reading about liberalism, basically American culture in general. The Civil War. Believe it or not, I'm not really that much into Civil War history per se. But I'm interested in kind of like the philosophical stuff. Why did, what this guy is talking about, Guelzo, what he's talking about is kind of a step or two above, they're talking about the ideas that led to a civil war, which I'm actually more interested in. Why did the South, feel so strongly about slavery. And it was fairly, eh, let me tell you something. The book that I've been talking about, The Empire of Cotton, that actually really fills in some gaps about why slavery was, so stubbornly held on to. At the time of the Civil War, these people, the South, the cotton farmers, the plantations, they were basically the Elon Musks of their day. They were rich, relatively speaking, for that time. They were rich as hell. Um, and the more slaves, the more cotton, et cetera, et cetera. So the causes of the Civil War are actually more interesting than studying the actual battles and things like that, at least to me. Yeah, I think he just had so much more land under private ownership. He was a huge land speculator. One of the things, a factor in the American Revolution was that Britain got tired of having to pay for a defense force in the Northwestern territories. They basically said, hey, no more going across the Alleghenies and doing land speculation. You're pissing off the Indians, and we're having to pay a bunch of money for defense. So, which basically hit the pocketbook of land speculators like George Washington.
That wasn't what was in view from the very start. So there's an understanding, and it's an understanding. It's also rooted in their reading of Polybius, which says revolutionary movements should be avoided as much as possible. That if you really want stable government, all right, it should have these three aspects. It should have this aspect of democracy. It should have this aspect of aristocracy. It should have this aspect of monarchy. So they enter into this with trepidation. Whereas the French Revolution is very different. The French Revolution is like one of the older revolutions in European history, which is to say, the uprising of an aggrieved class. It is, well, Barbara Tuchman talked about this at great length in that last great book of hers about the violent 14th century. And she talks about these revolutionary movements there, which were like Wat Tyler, for instance. I mean, these are jacqueries, right, to borrow the French term, much more than revolution. And the French Revolution, even though it has some origins in Enlightenment thinkers, is really an enormous jacquerie. And the jacquerie appeals to the romantic sensibility because it is a passionate, undirected kind of movement. The American Revolution is a very different affair. American Revolution is built around convictions, rationalizations, ideas that it has borrowed from its own experience, and it's borrowed from the example of Enlightenment political theory. There's almost a fork in the road here between 1776 and 1789. And the revolutionary road, the two great revolutionary highways, are what have run through human experience ever since. The American example, though, has not been without its potent imitators, much less to say its fervent admirers. People in Europe in the 19th century were quite conscious of the mistakes that had been made by 1789. And this is like Lamartine in 1848, telling the crowd, there's a great painting of this by Félix Philippetot, of Lamartine telling the crowd, no, put away the red banner. Put away the red banner. We're going to have the tricolore. That's what the revolution of 1848 is going to be about, is the tricolore. what he wanted to get, what Lamartine wanted to get us away from was this notion that what is going to happen in 1848 is going to be 1789 all over again. No, that's not really the case, Lamartine's argument is. He wants something different. He wants something that looks a whole lot closer to what Americans have done. And you see this in European aspirations for revolution in so many different times. I think of Kossuth and the Hungarian uprisings against Austrian authority. I see it in writer after writer after writer in the first half of the 19th century. I see it most dramatically, because I've probably read more on this point than others, about the Greek Revolution. And the Greek Revolution is constantly referring to the American Revolution as a model. So the American Revolution continues to exert a tremendous pull. It is not just the French Revolution takes over from the Americans. No, there are two highways of revolution, and one is the American, and one is the French. Which are people going to pick at a particular moment in their histories? I think the American revolutionary example still bids fair in the minds of many people, and to me, the most vivid confirmation of it occurred several years ago during the worst of the COVID shutdowns in China. There was a video that was circulating of a young man standing on a police barricade protesting the kind of repressive tactics being employed by the Chinese government, and shouting in Mandarin, as it was translated, "Give me liberty or give me death." And, I thought at that moment, Jonah, the American Revolution is not over. So there is a great American revolutionary tradition. It has not been extinguished. It's not a relic of the 18th century. It is something which speaks today because the principles of that revolution spoke to human nature itself. It spoke to natural law. It spoke to those natural rights that are hardwired into every human being. And in that respect, the American Revolution continues to have its impact, it continues to set its example, and not only to others, it continues to set its example to us, because in a lot of ways, even for Americans, the American Revolution is not over. We are always looking for that opportunity for a new birth, a rebirth, a revitalization of freedom. That is a great tradition, to speak of traditions, in which to participate.
Alan Gilzo, thank you so much for doing this. I hope you'll come back. There's so many other things we could talk about. The book, again, is volume 2 of The Golden Thread, A History of the Western Tradition. And it was a real pleasure. And again, I could go for hours, but I can't literally logistically go for hours. So very much appreciated.
All right. Well, it's been fun to have an opportunity to talk, and what a treat to go chasing ideas around the landscape.
All right. Alan has left the studio. I literally think, in terms of the content of just the second volume, never mind both volumes, you would need a decimal point and like 100 zeros and then a 1 to talk about like what percentage of the books we covered. It's just a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. They're glorious to look at. They are like any school that you see when you're looking on a syllabus that says that they're going to use this as the text. Give that school a couple extra points in your decision-making process. I will say I completely forgot, and I apologize to listeners, and I apologize to Alan Gelzo, who I hope it comes across. I sort of veer and adore. I had forgotten that we had gotten into a bit of a set to in the first conversation about what I think I can fairly call Alan's maximalist view of the importance of ideas. I disagree with him about this. It is a subtle disagreement. It is not a disagreement about the importance of ideas. It is a disagreement about the process by which these ideas are developed and sustained and all of that. And I didn't get into technology with him, but I think technology is a bigger driver. I think technology is a bigger driver of history than he does. And I'm happy to have him back on and talk about all that. I don't want to cast any aspersions here whatsoever. The guy's brilliant. But longtime readers and longtime listeners know that so when he talks about Edmund Burke being romantic, I disagree. I think there is a romantic side to Edmund Burke. I mean, he is a conservative. He is not a pure classical liberal or individualist or any of the sort. He defends class and aristocracy and monarchy more so than I do, because I don't defend any of those things as categories. But those are class was essentially the little platoon that he was talking about when he uses the phrase little platoons. And so, yeah, there is an element to Burke that is more celebratory of the irrational, accumulated customs and practices in life. I don't think it's a blood and soil thing for Burke. And so, one of my big things is that all poisons are determined by the dose. I don't think any irrationalism, any romanticism, any drop of any of those sorts of things is poisonous. It's how much you have in your thinking. And I would say that Burke's classical liberal side, his liberal side in the English, his Whiggish side, he called himself an old Whig, is more powerful than his romantic side. But I'm sort of with G.K. Chesterton on some of this stuff, that the purely rational, he says dogma is important because the purely rational man won't marry and the purely rational soldier won't fight. You need some commitments, as I think Alan was acknowledging, you need some commitments, notions of the divine or the transcendent or, external morality that cannot be fully captured and explained through rationality. But then you need to set up a system with reason to sustain that. And I think, I actually think Catholic religious thinking on this is very, very good. The romantic view is that conscience is just like another version of feelings, of instinct, of whatever feels right to you. That is not the Catholic understanding of conscience. The Catholic understanding of conscience is rightly formed conscience, and that requires reason. And one of the reasons why reason is important is it's the way you can appeal to other people's consciences and tell them, hey, look, I know your passions are telling you to lynch this guy, but listen to me as I explain to you why you shouldn't. That's the role of reason in appealing to conscience. And, but I, in part because human nature is made of crooked timber, right? We were all fallen. I think it's sort of folly to think you can get rid of all of the romantic side. It's there. You can't get rid of human nature. You have to keep it in check. You have to channel it in positive ways, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with anger. It all depends on what you're angry about. If you're angry about cruelty, you should be angry about cruelty because cruelty is evil. And so the way I put it for years, for 25 years, people have heard me talk about this in speeches. I think the line between Locke and Rousseau is an interesting one in terms of the Enlightenment divide, but it's also a line that goes through the human heart. We're all a little Lockean and we're all a little Rousseauian. And you could change that out and make it, two other thinkers, that's fine. But I don't think you can dismiss Burke as just a romantic, because being a little romantic is not an indictment. It's letting your romanticism take over and become a defense of systems. Now, his criticism of Burke saying everyone should pull their swords and defend Marie Antoinette, I'm much more sympathetic to that point, because the regime at that point probably should have gone, but it should have gone through incremental reform and that kind of thing. Anyway, I could go on about this a long time. Maybe I will in the solo. But just love talking to Alan Gelzo, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And with that, I'll see you next time.
All right. Yeah, tomorrow I'll show the first one.
Good morning.
I
It's
just
Sunday,
found
March
it.
8th, and this is the Georgia Gang.
So, the other thing, I found this BBC News Africa, Iran war, hearing from from the Afro-Iranian community. I did know that there are Afro-Iranians, but I didn't know. Did I know there's a whole community of them? I'm not sure that I did. I knew they existed. I didn't realize they were a community. So I don't know. You know what? I think I'm going to show this tomorrow. I'll save this for tomorrow because I'm coming up on 4 hours, and I've been up since early this morning. I'm feeling a little old man tired. So yeah, let me save this. All right, folks. I will be back hopefully earlier tomorrow afternoon. You know, I was on Nightish's show. So this show wound up starting up a little bit later than I wanted to. Let's see. Well, apparently you missed some bad French. So Natasha was glad you weren't here to have your ears offended. So in any case, everyone have a good evening, and we will reconvene tomorrow. We will see the first part of that Alan Gelzo interview, and then I want to watch this. This BBC Africa thing where they're interviewing an Afro-Iranian. So enjoyed it. Had a great time. See you all tomorrow.
Yeah.
With all that we have given them, we should own perhaps at least one half of this asset.
Smart,
the revenues generated because of it.
Like philosopher.
And it's not it, just take out the Obama race part. Why the fuck is the president of the United States hosting cartoons?
Stanley walked tall with a paperback brain.
Well, I don't know what it was, but the thing is that if you ever go and you kind of read these people's biographies,
fearing his shoes, library brave.
The MAGA blacks, you get a bunch of MAGA blacks. That's what you get out of it, President. You get MAGA blacks who will put. I'm a drunk old man with a head shaped like a shroom. And then the other thing we've forgotten is brevity. That's the main lesson I learned today, and I know